Have you ever felt danger before anything actually happened, before the sound was clear, before the words were spoken, before your mind could explain it? Something inside you was already awake. Hidden deep inside your brain is an ancient survival system, older than language, older than reason, and it may be controlling far more of your life than you realize. Tonight, we uncover the secret machinery that decides fear, safety, instinct, and survival itself. Before we go deeper, like the video and subscribe to the channel if you enjoy mysteries of the human mind, science, and the hidden forces shaping our lives. It begins before the thought has a name, before language gathers itself, before reason arrives with its careful explanations. Somewhere in the dark interior of the skull, beneath the polished surfaces that speak, plan, calculate, and pretend to be in charge, something older is already awake. It does not sleep in the way the rest of the mind sleeps. It does not wait for permission. It listens through the night. It tastes change in the blood. It notices a sound in the corridor, a shadow in the edge of vision, a shift in breathing, a face that has gone suddenly unreadable, and in a fraction of a second, long before the conscious self has finished asking what is happening, this hidden system has begun to decide whether the world remains safe. A person can spend years thinking of the brain as the seat of identity, the place where memory is stored and decisions are made, the organ of thought, imagination, and self-control. That picture is not exactly wrong. It is simply incomplete in a way that matters. Beneath the version of the brain that writes books, composes messages, balances accounts, and reflects on childhood is another arrangement of circuits with far older priorities. It is not interested in wisdom. It is not interested in beauty unless beauty signals safety. It is not interested in truth for its own sake. Its first concern is survival, and survival is a brutal editor. It cuts away everything that does not help the body remain alive for a little longer. It changes pulse, posture, attention, chemistry, and muscle tone in the space between one heartbeat and the next. It narrows the world, brightens danger, suppresses distraction, and prepares the body for action even when the thinking mind is still trying to be civilized. This is one of the strangest things about being human. The creature that writes philosophy and sends spacecraft beyond the planets is also inhabited by a set of emergency mechanisms so ancient that they belong, in some form, to a world older than humanity itself. They belong to a long biological past of teeth in grass, movement in reeds, winter scarcity, infected wounds, unstable alliances, and the permanent possibility that one mistake might be the last one. What survives in the record suggests that life does not evolve by becoming calm. It evolves by becoming responsive. It learns to notice, to react, to avoid, to cling, to run, to freeze, to remember. And in the human brain, those old lessons are not buried relics. They are active, intimate, and often invisible to the person they control. That invisibility may be the most unsettling part. People do not usually feel the machinery itself. They feel its effects, a tightening in the chest before bad news is spoken aloud, the instant dislike of a stranger whose face resembles someone forgotten, the inability to think clearly in the middle of an argument, the way shame burns like injury, the way loneliness becomes physical, the way a smell can return a person to a moment they believed was gone, the way silence in the wrong place can feel heavier than noise. The body is often the first witness to danger, real or perceived, and the brain's survival system is the one writing those signals into flesh. This is why fear is rarely just fear. It is a whole rearrangement of priorities. A person walking home at night hears footsteps behind them. Nothing has happened yet. No hand has reached out. No voice has spoken. Still, something changes instantly. The skin sharpens. The ears begin sorting sound with obsessive care. Vision stretches toward movement. The shoulders tense. The stomach tightens. The future rushes inward. There are suddenly only a few meaningful things in the world distance. Exits. Pace. Risk. Possibility. The mind that a moment earlier could have wandered to music, errands, childhood, or dinner is now narrowed into a much older shape. This narrowing is not failure. It is design. Before we go deeper, take a moment to like the video and subscribe. If this is the kind of history and mystery you enjoy, for most of human existence, the system that creates that narrowing is the difference between continuation and disappearance. It belongs to a history written not in monuments or king's lists, but in nerves, glands, reflexes, and patterns of blood flow. It is a hidden survival architecture, layered piece by piece across immense stretches of time, then inherited by modern humans who use it in environments its earliest builders could never have imagined. The strange result is that people now carry Stone Age alarms into office towers, carry predator detection circuits into airports and schools, carry exclusion-sensitive social pain into digital networks where judgment never sleeps. The machinery remains ancient even when the threats become symbolic. That is part of the mystery. Another part is that the brain often treats the symbolic as if it were physical. An unpaid debt, a humiliating message, a delayed reply, a room full of disapproval. The fear of losing status, the feeling of being trapped in public embarrassment, all of these can stir ancient systems with surprising force. This does not mean modern people are weak, or damaged, or failing to adapt. It means the human brain is not built from the top down by reason. It is built from the bottom up by survival. The newer regions that support planning and language are real achievements, but they are layered over older networks rather than replacing them. The civilized self speaks in full sentences. The survival self speaks in acceleration, contraction, sweating, vigilance, nausea, silence, sleeplessness, and an overwhelming need to do something now. The first self explains, the second acts. Often they cooperate, often they compete, and at moments of stress, it becomes painfully clear which one has the older authority. There is persistent modern fantasy that true maturity means becoming rational enough to outgrow these ancient reactions. That fantasy is attractive because it flatters consciousness. It suggests that with enough intelligence, education, discipline, or self-knowledge, a person can become a creature governed mainly by thought. Yet the evidence points somewhere less comforting. Thought is never alone in the brain. It is housed inside a living body whose survival systems are always monitoring the background conditions of existence. Blood sugar, inflammation, temperature, breathing, social signals, sleep debt, uncertainty, prior injury, remembered threat, and anticipated loss all influence what the mind experiences as ordinary reality. A person may believe they are calmly interpreting the world when they are actually perceiving it through chemistry already altered by vigilance. This is why two people can walk into the same room and live in two different versions of it. One feels ease, the other feels threat. One notices the light, the other notices the exits. One hears conversation, the other hears possible ridicule. The difference is not always visible from the outside, because the survival system is both deeply biological and highly interpretive. It does not merely react to claws and falling rocks. It reacts to patterns. It builds expectations. It learns from association. It compares the present with fragments of the past and produces predictions so quickly that consciousness often mistakes them for facts. Scholars still debate the exact mechanisms by which different brain systems cooperate to generate these rapid judgments. But the broad picture is clear: the brain is not waiting passively for the world to reveal itself. It is constantly guessing what kind of world this is, and whether the body inside it is safe enough to relax. That guessing begins earlier than most people realize. The brain does not first receive a perfectly objective world and then decide how to feel about it. Instead, it filters incoming signals through priorities that have been shaped by evolution, development, memory, and current bodily state. Attention is not neutral. It is biased toward what may matter for survival. A face that looks angry, a movement that seems too fast, a silence where reassurance was expected, the smell of smoke, the unfamiliar shape by the road, the slight instability in someone's voice. These details rise in importance because ancient survival logic has trained the brain to treat ambiguity with suspicion. False alarms are costly, but missed danger can be fatal. Across evolutionary time, that asymmetry leaves marks. This helps explain why the hidden survival system can feel unfair. It often overreacts. It notices things a person would rather ignore. It stores discomfort with stubborn intensity. It can turn a harmless room into a place of dread, or transform a routine medical test into a full-body emergency. It can make calm advice feel useless, because the part of the mind receiving the advice is not the part currently steering the organism. People in panic are often told they are safe, and sometimes they even believe it in a thin, intellectual way, while the body remains utterly unconvinced. That split is one of the signatures of the hidden system. Safety known as information is not always the same as safety felt in the nervous system. To understand why this happens, it helps to abandon the comforting image of the self as a single, unified commander. The brain is more like a negotiated settlement between older and newer forms of intelligence. Some are fast, automatic, and metabolically expensive. Some are slower, flexible, and articulate. Some specialize in detecting change, some in remembering patterns, some in regulating the heart, lungs, and gut, some in interpreting faces and voices, some in suppressing impulses. These are not neatly sealed compartments, and no single explanation fully accounts for their interplay. But together they form a living hierarchy of priorities. And near the foundation of that hierarchy is the problem that shaped almost everything else: how to keep a vulnerable body alive in an uncertain world. The vulnerability matters. Human beings are not armored creatures. Their skin tears. Their sleep can be interrupted. Their young require years of care. They depend on water that can fail, food that can vanish, groups that can reject them, and environments that can turn hostile without warning. The human brain develops inside this biological fragility, and the survival system reflects it. It is not designed for serene detachment. It is designed for costly responsiveness. Better to waste energy on vigilance than fail to detect a threat. Better to remember the dangerous place too well than forget it too easily. Better to be embarrassed into conformity than expelled from the group that keeps hunger and predators away. Much of what modern people experience as emotional inconvenience begins to make grim sense when seen against these older conditions. The hidden system is not purely individual either. From the start, it is social. A human infant cannot survive alone. That fact leaves an immense mark on the brain. Safety is not only shelter from weather or predators, safety is also presence, regulation, familiarity, recognition, touch, predictability. The nervous system learns early whether the world answers distress with comfort or with chaos. Even in adulthood, traces of this remain. A calm voice can slow a racing body. Isolation can make danger feel larger. Humiliation can wound with a force that seems disproportionate until one remembers that, in the long human past, exclusion is not merely unpleasant, it can be lethal. The survival brain never fully forgets this. And yet, for all its severity, this hidden system is not simply a source of misery. It is also the basis of endurance. The same machinery that produces fear also produces rapid adaptation. The same capacity to remember pain allows creatures to avoid repeating fatal mistakes. The same sensitivity to other people's expressions makes cooperation possible. Even the body's most exhausting states of alarm are, in origin, attempts at protection. There is a dry irony in this. Some of the worst feelings humans know are generated by systems that are trying, in their blunt and ancient way, to preserve life. What makes the story especially compelling is that this survival architecture remains partly concealed even from those who study it. Neuroscience has mapped remarkable detail, identifying structures, networks, signaling molecules, and pathways between brain and body. Researchers can trace threat responses, hormonal cascades, reflex arcs, and changes in attention. They can watch regions activate, inhibit, synchronize, and fall silent. But the evidence remains incomplete. The brain is not a machine that reveals its purpose through a single gear. It is a dense historical object, built by modification rather than elegant design, where old and new systems overlap, improvise, and sometimes conflict. Every discovery clarifies something and complicates something else. Still, the central fact stands. Inside every ordinary human life there is a hidden emergency intelligence. It is there in childhood, where it learns the emotional climate of the world. It is there in adolescence, when social danger can feel catastrophic. It is there in adulthood, influencing love, risk, ambition, caution, sleep, memory, pain, appetite, posture, and trust. It is there in the soldier before battle, in the driver who swerves before knowing why, in the patient waiting for results, in the parent waking to a child's small sound, in the lonely person staring at a silent phone. It is there in the body before speech. And once that becomes visible, even dimly, the human story changes shape. Much of what seems irrational becomes legible. Much of what looks like weakness begins to resemble adaptation carried into the wrong setting, or persistence after the danger should have ended. The polished surface of consciousness remains important, but it no longer seems sovereign. Beneath it lies something older, watchful, unsentimental, and astonishingly fast. It keeps account in pulse and breath. It searches the horizon for trouble. It decides, again and again, whether the world outside the skull can be trusted for one more moment. The mystery is not that such a system exists. In a dangerous world, something like it is inevitable. The real mystery is how much of human life has been shaped by forces most people rarely notice, directly alarms that sound below language, judgments made below awareness, memories stored in muscle and sensation, fears inherited from worlds long vanished, an ancient protective logic still active in bodies moving through fluorescent hallways, glowing screens, and crowded cities. The brain modern humans praise for its intelligence is also, and perhaps first, a survival organ. It carries the deep past into the present. It turns history into physiology. And long before it helps a person understand life, it works to keep that life from ending. long before language forms its first symbols, long before tools become precise and societies become complex. There is already a problem that every living organism must solve again and again: how to remain alive in a world that does not promise safety. The solution to that problem does not appear all at once. It builds slowly, layer by layer, across vast stretches of time, shaped by pressure rather than intention. The survival system inside the human brain is not a single invention. It is an accumulation, a deep inheritance of countless small adjustments made by organisms that either endured or disappeared. To understand what lives inside the modern skull, it helps to step far back, beyond cities, beyond agriculture, beyond even early humans, into a time when the boundaries between predator and prey are the most important features of existence. In those earlier environments, awareness is not a philosophical trait. It is a biological necessity. Creatures that detect change quickly gain an advantage. A slight rustle in grass, a shift in wind direction, the faintest scent of something unfamiliar. These signals become the difference between feeding and being fed upon. Over time, nervous systems evolve to specialize in noticing patterns that matter. They do not need to understand those patterns in any abstract sense. They need only to react to them with sufficient speed and consistency. What emerges is a form of intelligence that is not reflective but reactive. It is fast, automatic, and deeply tied to the body. Early neural circuits begin to connect sensation directly to action. A shadow triggers a contraction. A sound triggers movement. A sudden stimulus produces a full body response before any delay could introduce fatal hesitation. This immediacy becomes one of the defining features of survival systems across species. The ability to bypass slow processing is not a flaw. It is a necessity in environments where hesitation is costly. As life becomes more complex, so do these systems. Instead of reacting only to immediate stimuli, organisms begin to benefit from remembering. If a particular place consistently leads to danger, remembering that place becomes valuable. If a certain smell predicts food, that association becomes worth preserving. Memory, in this sense, is not originally about storytelling or identity. It is about prediction. It allows the organism to anticipate what might happen next based on what has happened before. And with prediction comes a new kind of vigilance. The world is no longer experienced only as it is in the present moment. It is filtered through expectation. In early mammals, this shift becomes especially significant. Compared to many reptiles, mammals develop more flexible nervous systems. They can learn more quickly, adapt to changing environments, and respond to a wider range of conditions. But this flexibility comes at a cost. A brain that can imagine possibilities must also consider negative ones. The capacity to predict danger increases, but so does the potential for false alarms. The system becomes more sensitive, more cautious, and more dependent on context. It begins to weigh not just what is happening, but what could happen. Somewhere in this long process, a pattern emerges that will remain central to human experience: the bias toward caution. In evolutionary terms, it is often safer to assume danger when none exists than to miss a real threat. A false alarm may waste energy. A missed predator may end everything. Over time, this asymmetry shapes the survival system into something that leans toward vigilance. It does not aim for perfect accuracy. It aims for sufficient protection. What survives in the record suggests that this bias becomes deeply embedded. Even in modern humans, the brain is more responsive to negative stimuli than positive ones. Loss is felt more intensely than gain. Threat captures attention more quickly than safety. Pain lingers longer in memory than comfort. These tendencies are not arbitrary. They reflect a long history in which underestimating danger carried greater consequences than overestimating it. As human ancestors begin to form more complex social groups, another layer is added. Survival is no longer only about avoiding predators or finding food, it is also about navigating relationships. Belonging becomes critical. Cooperation increases the chances of survival, but it also introduces new risks: conflict, exclusion, betrayal, competition. The brain begins to treat social signals with the same seriousness it once reserved for physical threats. A hostile expression, a shift in tone, a break in expected behavior, these become meaningful cues that require rapid interpretation. This is where the survival system expands beyond simple fight or flight responses. It begins to include strategies for negotiation, submission, alliance, and repair. Not every threat can be escaped or confronted directly. Some must be managed within the group. The nervous system adapts to this complexity by developing a wider range of responses, many of which are subtle and difficult to recognize from the outside. A person may feel tension, hesitation, or discomfort without immediately understanding that these sensations are rooted in ancient social survival mechanisms. The environment continues to shape these systems in profound ways. Climate shifts, resource scarcity, migration, and changing ecosystems all place new demands on the brain. Groups that can adapt quickly to new conditions are more likely to survive. This favors individuals whose nervous systems can recalibrate, learn from experience, and remain flexible under pressure. But flexibility does not eliminate the underlying bias toward caution. If anything, it reinforces it. In uncertain environments, the safest strategy is often to remain alert to multiple possibilities at once. As Homo sapiens emerges, the brain carries all of this history forward. It is larger, more complex, and capable of extraordinary feats of reasoning and creativity, but the foundational layers remain. The circuits that detect threat, store emotional memory, regulate bodily responses, and interpret social signals are not replaced. They are integrated into a broader system that includes language, abstract thinking, and long-term planning. The result is a brain that can reflect on its own experiences while still being driven by mechanisms that operate below awareness. This layering creates a tension that defines much of human life. The newer parts of the brain can imagine futures, construct narratives, and evaluate choices. They can override impulses, delay gratification, and consider consequences. But they do not operate in isolation. They are constantly influenced by older systems that prioritize immediate survival. When these systems align, behavior feels coherent and purposeful. When they conflict, the experience can be confusing or distressing. A person may know that a situation is safe and still feel overwhelming fear. They may want to act in one way but find their body responding in another. Scholars still debate the precise boundaries between these layers and how they interact. But the general principle is clear. The brain is not a single unified structure with a single goal. It is a composite of systems with different priorities, shaped by different evolutionary pressures. Some aim for long-term stability, others aim for immediate protection. Some seek connection, others guard against vulnerability. Together, they create a dynamic balance that is constantly shifting in response to both internal and external conditions. One of the more surprising details that emerges from this perspective is that the survival system does not simply react to threats. It actively constructs a sense of safety. Safety is not just the absence of danger. It is a state that the brain must recognize and maintain. This involves monitoring the body, the environment, and other people for signs that things are stable enough to relax. When those signals are present, the nervous system allows for exploration, learning, and social engagement. When they are absent or ambiguous, the system tightens, preparing for possible disruption. This ability to shift between states is essential for survival. A creature that remains constantly alert will exhaust itself. A creature that relaxes too easily may not notice danger in time. The survival system must therefore balance readiness with recovery. It must know when to activate and when to stand down. In practice, this balance is not always perfect. Modern environments, with their constant stimulation and abstract pressures, can make it difficult for the system to recognize true safety. The result is a form of chronic vigilance that does not correspond to immediate physical danger, but still feels urgent and real. Looking back across evolutionary time, it becomes clear that the survival system is not designed for comfort. It is designed for persistence. It favors strategies that increase the likelihood of survival, even if they produce discomfort, anxiety, or conflict. This can be difficult to accept from a modern perspective that often prioritizes well-being and emotional stability. But within the logic of evolution, survival is the primary currency. Everything else is secondary. At the same time, this system is not static. It continues to adapt throughout an individual's life. Experiences shape its sensitivity, its thresholds, and its patterns of response. Early environments play a particularly important role, setting the baseline for how the brain interprets safety and threat. But change remains possible. The same flexibility that allowed early mammals to adapt to shifting conditions allows modern humans to recalibrate their responses under the right circumstances. This ongoing capacity for change is one of the most important aspects of the survival system. It means that the patterns established in one context do not have to remain fixed in another. It also means that the system can become misaligned when conditions change more quickly than it can adapt. The modern world, with its rapid technological and social transformations, presents challenges that the brain's ancient architecture was not specifically designed to handle. Yet it continues to operate using the same fundamental principles: detect, predict, respond, remember. In this sense, the survival system is both a relic and a living process. It carries the imprint of environments that no longer exist, while actively shaping behavior in environments that would have been unimaginable to early humans. It is the reason a sudden noise can still startle a person in a quiet room, why social rejection can feel physically painful, why uncertainty can produce deep unease even in the absence of immediate danger. These responses are not arbitrary. They are echoes of a long evolutionary history, still active in the present. As the brain continues to evolve culturally and individually, the question is not whether this system will disappear. It will not. The question is how it will continue to interact with the newer layers of human cognition, and how individuals and societies will learn to live with a mechanism that is both essential and, at times, overwhelming. The story of that interaction is not yet finished. It is unfolding in real time, shaped by every environment, every experience, and every moment in which the brain must decide once again whether the world is safe enough to allow the body to rest. The signal arrives, and the brain begins sorting it before the mind can describe it. A shape at the edge of vision, a voice with something wrong in its tone, the subtle asymmetry of a face that should be familiar but suddenly does not look safe. A movement too fast, too direct, too difficult to place. In ordinary life, people like to imagine that perception works in a clean sequence. First, the senses gather information. then the brain examines it, then thought decides what it means. And only after that does emotion arrive. The reality is far stranger, faster, and much less flattering to conscious control. The brain does not simply watch the world and wait. It watches first, guesses first, and often reacts first. This early watching is one of the most ancient and necessary powers the nervous system possesses. In a dangerous environment, the organism that pauses too long to analyze a possible threat is already at a disadvantage. Survival depends not on perfect interpretation but on rapid discrimination. Something in the environment must be sorted quickly into broad categories safe enough to ignore, important enough to monitor, dangerous enough to change the body immediately. That sorting happens through distributed networks rather than a single neat command post. But the effect is remarkably unified. Attention shifts, the body prepares, perception narrows or sharpens. Time itself can seem to change, stretching around the moment as the brain allocates more resources to what suddenly matters. At the center of this process lies a harsh principle. The brain is not trying to build a fully objective picture of reality before acting. It is trying to stay ahead of reality by prediction. It uses fragments, patterns, prior experience, and incomplete sensory data to generate a best guess about what kind of situation this is. That guess can be wrong. Often it is only partly right. But speed is more valuable than elegance. And so the survival system prefers usable approximations over delayed certainty. If a coiled object on the ground might be a snake, jumping first has obvious advantages. It is easier to apologize to the nervous system for a false alarm than to recover from a bite. This explains why threat detection feels so immediate and so stubborn. A person does not decide to flinch when something rushes toward their face. A person does not calmly vote on whether a scream in the dark deserves attention. These reactions are not failures of composure. They are the visible edge of an older intelligence operating on the assumption that hesitation can kill. Even when the danger turns out to be harmless, the body has already been recruited. Muscles tighten, eyes widen. The chest contracts, and the mind scrambles to catch up with a decision that, in practical terms, has already been made. One of the best-known structures involved in this rapid appraisal is the amygdala, though popular culture has turned it into a kind of cartoon villain, a tiny almond-shaped center supposedly responsible for fear and little else. The truth is less tidy and more interesting. The amygdala is deeply involved in detecting salience, especially emotionally relevant or threatening information, but it does not act alone. And it is not simply a fear button. It helps the brain decide what deserves urgent priority. It learns associations. It participates in memory formation. It responds to ambiguity as well as obvious threat. It is less a crude alarm bell than part of a wider network that constantly asks whether something matters enough to change what the body should do next. The speed of this network depends partly on the existence of fast pathways that allow coarse information to be processed before perception becomes fully detailed. A person may respond to the rough outline of danger before consciously identifying it, a flash of movement, a looming form, a sudden shift in expression can trigger the first wave of alarm with astonishing speed. Later, slower systems refine the interpretation, sometimes confirming the alarm and sometimes correcting it. But by then, the organism is already in motion internally. The heart may be faster, the breathing shallower, attention already narrowed around the possible threat. Safety discovered a second later does not erase the fact that the body has begun to mobilize. This arrangement reveals something important and slightly humiliating about human consciousness. The feeling of being fully in charge is often a retrospective illusion. people experience themselves as deciding what to fear, what to notice, what deserves urgency. Yet much of that prioritization has already occurred below awareness. Consciousness often narrates decisions that were prepared in advance by more ancient systems. It does not invent all urgency from scratch, it inherits it. The polished verbal mind then steps in, not always to control the reaction, but to explain it, justify it, or argue with it after the fact. The watching brain is therefore not neutral, it is biased by design. It notices suddenness, unpredictability, conflict, pain, looming shapes, certain facial cues, violations of expectation, and signs of contamination or instability. It is also heavily influenced by personal history. A person who has learned, through repeated experience, that anger leads to danger may detect tension in a room long before anyone else does. Another person may be especially sensitive to silence, or to the sound of footsteps, or to a certain kind of glance, because the survival system has been trained by association to treat those cues as meaningful. What looks like oversensitivity from the outside may actually be a specialized form of learning, though one carried into a context where it no longer fits cleanly. This is one reason people can react so differently to the same environment. The brain's early warning machinery is not only inherited, it is tuned. It takes the broad architecture shaped by evolution and calibrates it through development and experience. Over time, the nervous system builds a private map of likely danger. Some of that map is conscious, but much of it is not. A person may have no clear story about why a place feels wrong, why a tone of voice produces instant dread, or why the presence of certain people causes an inexplicable bodily tightening. Yet the body behaves as though it knows. In a sense, it does. It has learned patterns the conscious mind cannot always easily translate. The visual system offers a powerful example of how quickly this can happen. Human beings are exceptionally responsive to faces, eyes, posture, and movement. They do not simply see other people as neutral objects in space. They scan them for intention. Is that face welcoming, distracted, hostile, ashamed, dominant, afraid? Is that body moving toward me with purpose or away from me with alarm? Is that smile real, strained, or absent at the wrong moment? The brain extracts these signals with astonishing speed because other humans are among the most important features of the environment. Across human history, another person may bring protection, alliance, knowledge, food, love, rivalry, humiliation, or death. The survival system treats such information accordingly. Voices matter too. Long before words are consciously analyzed, tone can reach the nervous system as evidence, a sharpness, a hesitation, a sudden drop in warmth, an unfamiliar flatness in someone usually calm. These can alter the body quickly. It is possible to know that a conversation has become dangerous before one could explain why. The same is true of crowds, confined spaces, open exposure, darkness, and silence. The brain is always matching current sensory input against prediction. When the match is poor, alertness rises. Ambiguity itself can become a trigger, because an unclear situation may conceal threat. Scholars still debate how best to describe the balance between bottom-up sensory input and top-down predictive processing in these moments. The evidence remains incomplete, and the terminology shifts across different fields. But the broad insight is difficult to avoid. Perception is not passive reception. It is active inference. The brain builds a model of what is probably happening and continuously updates that model as new information arrives. In a survival context, The cost of underestimating danger often outweighs the cost of overestimating it, so the model may lean toward caution, especially when prior experience has made the system more vigilant. This helps explain phenomena that otherwise seem irrational. A person mistakes a coat hanging in dim light for an intruder. Another hears accusation in a neutral sentence. Another feels instant panic in a room that resembles one associated with past threat. These are not necessarily signs of madness or stupidity. They are examples of a predictive survival brain using imperfect evidence under biased conditions. The system is doing what it was built to do, err on the side of readiness. Reason may later intervene, adjusting the interpretation, but reason enters a scene already shaped by physiological change. And once the watching brain flags something as important, attention becomes a weapon. The world contracts around the relevant cue, background detail fades, neutral information becomes harder to process. This selective attention is deeply adaptive. In danger, broad curiosity is inefficient. Focus matters. But the same narrowing can become a problem when the threat is uncertain, abstract, or social. A person waiting for medical results may become unable to notice ordinary pleasures because every internal sensation is recruited into an anxious scan. A person who fears rejection may spend an evening reading tiny expressions instead of hearing the actual conversation. The survival system does not merely detect threat, it reorganizes reality around it. This reorganization can feel almost supernatural from the inside. People describe knowing something was wrong before they could explain how they knew. Sometimes this is exaggeration, hindsight, or pattern-making after the fact. But sometimes it reflects genuine, rapid processing. The brain can register subtle cues outside conscious awareness and produce a bodily sense of unease before the person identifies the source. A slight limp in a stranger's approach, the smell of smoke before visible flame, the unnatural quiet of a familiar place, the mismatch between someone's smile and their eyes. These fragments may be enough to move the system toward alertness. Conscious thought then arrives later and calls it intuition. Intuition, in many cases, is not magic. It is compressed pattern recognition running through ancient survival priorities. That does not make it infallible. It can be distorted by prejudice, trauma, fatigue, and learned fear. It can label safety as danger or familiarity as trustworthiness, when neither judgment is deserved. No single explanation fully accounts for why intuition is sharp in some moments and catastrophically misleading in others. But it is often the voice of the watching brain, translating 1,000 small comparisons into a feeling simple enough for consciousness to receive pay attention. The cost of such efficiency is that false alarms are woven into the system. The same machinery that notices real threat is fully capable of frightening a person with shadows, misunderstandings, and predictions that never come true. Yet from the perspective of evolution, this is not necessarily poor engineering. A nervous system that occasionally startles at harmless movement may survive better than one that remains elegantly calm until the wrong moment. There is a dry ruthlessness in this logic. It does not promise peace, it promises odds. And the watching never truly stops. Even in quiet moments, the brain is monitoring bodily sensation, sound, proximity, facial expression, environmental predictability, and internal memory traces. Even in sleep, parts of the system remain alert to unusual signals. Parents wake at the small sounds of a child and sleep through traffic. A person in an unfamiliar place may sleep lightly while another rests deeply. The system prioritizes according to what it believes matters most. Whether or not the conscious mind approves, by the time a human being believes they have seen danger, Much has already happened beneath the threshold of language. Signals have been weighed, compared, amplified, or dismissed. Predictions have been launched. The body has been placed on notice. The brain that watches first is not glamorous. It is not philosophical. It has little patience for nuance when uncertainty rises, but it is ancient, tireless, and astonishingly efficient. It lives beneath thought without asking permission from thought. And once it decides that something in the world deserves urgent attention, the rest of the mind often finds itself living inside that decision. Once the signal is judged serious enough, the brain does not keep the news to itself. It sends orders outward with astonishing speed, and the body begins to change before the person has chosen any clear response at all. This is one of the defining features of the hidden survival system. It is not a private drama taking place inside thought. It is a command structure. It converts perception into physiology. A possible threat becomes a different pulse, a different breathing pattern, a different blood distribution, a different posture, a different readiness in muscle and gut. In that moment, the body stops being a neutral container for the mind and becomes the field on which survival is organized. The shift can be subtle or extreme. At one end, it is the slight tightening in the stomach before opening a message that may contain bad news. The involuntary straightening of the back when hearing footsteps approach from behind. The small drop in warmth when entering a room where something feels off. At the other end, it is the full flood of panic, the hammering heart, the dry mouth, the tremor in the limbs, the peculiar sensation that the world has grown both sharper and less real. Between those extremes lies an enormous range of bodily states, all produced by the same fundamental logic. Once the brain estimates that something important may be at stake, it begins to prepare the organism not for truth, but for action. Much of this depends on the autonomic nervous system, the network that regulates heart rate, blood pressure, breathing, digestion, sweating, pupil size, and countless other processes people like to imagine they are not actively controlling because they are happening in the background. But the background is never merely background. It is the infrastructure of survival. In calm conditions, the body spends resources on maintenance, repair, digestion, social engagement, and long-term regulation. Under threat, priorities shift. Energy must be mobilized. Unnecessary processes are postponed. Blood flow is adjusted. Attention is narrowed. The body becomes less interested in comfort and more interested in immediate capacity. This is why fear so often feels physical before it feels mental. The racing heart is not a decorative symptom. It is a delivery system, pushing oxygen and fuel toward tissues that may need to act quickly. The quickened breathing is not random chaos. It is preparation, even if in some cases it becomes excessive and destabilizing. The widening pupils admit more visual information. Muscles become tense because readiness is costly if it begins only after the danger is certain. Digestion slows because lunch is a low priority if the organism may need to run. The skin may cool, the hands may sweat, the mouth may dry. These are not poetic metaphors for fear. They are the logistics of a body being reassigned. The command chain that creates this response is distributed. But one of its most important chemical instruments is the release of stress hormones, including adrenaline and cortisol. Popular conversation often reduces these substances to simple villains, but that misses their ancient practicality. Adrenaline sharpens the immediate response. It helps create the sense of urgency, the rapid cardiovascular shift, the feeling of readiness that can border on violence even when the person never moves. Cortisol works on a slightly different timescale. helping sustain alertness and manage resources over longer periods. In the short term, this can be extraordinarily useful. It keeps the organism mobilized when the danger is not over in seconds. It helps convert a brief alarm into a state of continued preparedness. The trouble begins when a system built for bursts becomes a way of life. But before that larger problem arrives, it is worth seeing how brilliant the design can be in immediate danger. A person steps off a curb and notices, not through careful reflection, but almost through a bodily jolt, that a vehicle is moving faster than expected. They leap back before a full sentence forms in the mind. Later they may describe instinct, reflex, or luck. Yet beneath those words is a coordinated event. Visual information has been assessed, threat value has been assigned, motor readiness has been increased, the body has been recruited and moved, the survival system has done what it was built to do. Even the immune system, once thought of as separate from emotion and thought, is drawn into these states more deeply than earlier generations realized. The evidence suggests that stress and perceived threat can alter inflammatory signaling, wound healing, susceptibility to illness, and the general balance of bodily maintenance. The body does not divide itself into neat categories of physical and psychological emergency. From its perspective, danger is danger, a social threat, a chronic fear, or a major loss can alter physiology in ways that are measurable, not because the body's confused, but because the systems involved evolved to coordinate under conditions where many threats arrive together. Injury, social instability, hunger, exposure, and fear were not separate academic disciplines in ancient environments. They were often overlapping aspects of the same crisis. This helps explain why some forms of modern stress feel so consuming. A person facing public humiliation, financial precarity, or prolonged uncertainty may tell themselves that nothing is physically attacking them. Yet the body may behave as though siege has already begun. Sleep changes, appetite changes, recovery slows, attention becomes rigid or fragmented. The startle response intensifies. The person becomes harder to soothe, not because they lack discipline, but because the command systems governing survival are not designed to wait for philosophical reassurance. They're designed to prepare for costly possibilities. The body under threat also becomes strangely selective in what it allows. Pain may disappear for a time if immediate escape matters more than tissue damage. This is one of the more surprising details in survival physiology. Severe injuries are sometimes not felt fully until after danger has passed. Soldiers, athletes, accident survivors, and disaster witnesses have long described functioning through wounds that only later become obvious. The explanation is not mystical toughness. It is prioritization. The brain can suppress or gate aspects of pain when action is more urgently required. At other times it can heighten pain, forcing rest or protection. Pain, like fear, is not a simple readout of damage. It is part of the survival strategy. The same is true of time. During sudden danger, many people report that events seem to slow down. The evidence remains debated as to whether time itself is subjectively stretched in the moment, or whether memory simply becomes denser afterward, giving the impression of an extended interval. But the experience is common enough to matter. Under acute threat, the brain allocates resources with unusual intensity. More details are noticed. More information is tagged as important. The event becomes heavily imprinted. Whether or not time truly feels slower while it happens, the system behaves as though every fraction of a second matters more than usual. There is also a social dimension to these bodily commands. Humans are not solitary mammals built only for attack or escape. They are cooperative creatures whose survival often depends on reading others, signaling distress, receiving reassurance, and coordinating with the group. The body reflects this. In some circumstances, the safest response is not aggression or flight, but stillness, appeasement, silence, or a search for proximity to someone trusted. Heart rate, facial expression, vocal tone, and posture are part of this communication. The body does not merely prepare for action against the environment. It also broadcasts state to other nervous systems. Calm can spread, panic can spread, authority can steady a group or destabilize it. The command chain runs through biology, but it is never purely private biology. Scholars still debate how best to describe these interactions between brain, body, and social context. No single explanation fully accounts for why some people move toward others when frightened while others withdraw, or why identical bodily arousal can be experienced as excitement in one setting and terror in another. But the evidence remains clear on one point: the body does not passively receive emotion. It helps generate it. A pounding heart is not simply the consequence of fear. It can also intensify the feeling of fear once noticed. Shallow breathing can strengthen the sense of alarm. Tension in the face can alter how a person interprets the room around them. The survival system is circular as much as linear. Brain changes body, body changes brain, and the loop can either resolve quickly or build into a storm. This circularity is part of why calm advice often fails in the middle of acute distress. Telling a terrified person to relax may be intellectually sensible, but the command arrives late and weak compared to the full bodily evidence that something is wrong. The chest is tight, the hands are cold, the pulse is violent, the stomach is clenched, the vision feels altered, and attention is trapped on signs of danger. Under those conditions, abstract reasoning can sound almost absurd. The person is not simply entertaining a fearful idea, they are inhabiting a survival state. The body has already been convinced. It is also why bodily interventions can sometimes reach places words cannot. Slow breathing, movement, touch, warmth, posture, rhythm, and environmental predictability can all change the message traveling back to the brain. This does not mean the system is easily controlled, far from it. But it does mean that survival states are not made only of beliefs. They are made of physiology, and physiology can sometimes be guided from more than one direction. The body is not merely the victim of the brain's alarms, it is also one of the pathways through which alarms may be softened. Still, the most striking feature of this command structure is its speed and seriousness. Once the order is given, ordinary priorities are suspended. A person may lose appetite before a difficult conversation, not because they have rationally chosen fasting, but because the body has judged digestion less important than vigilance. A person may become incapable of sleep before a possible threat has fully materialized. Another may suddenly need to pace, move, scan, check, call, or flee. These impulses can feel irrational when seen from the outside, yet they make ancient sense. The body is being asked to prepare for uncertainty, and preparation is often restless. All of this reveals a difficult truth about human experience. Thought likes to imagine it rules by persuasion, but survival often rules by condition. The body is altered first, and then the mind must interpret living inside those alterations. This is why bodily states shape meaning so powerfully. The same room looks different when the heart is calm than when it's pounding. The same face looks different when the chest is loose than when it is tight. The same future looks different when the organism is at rest than when it has already been placed on alert. So the hidden survival system does not merely identify danger, it issues commands that reorganize the organism from within. It drafts the heart into service, pulls the lungs into rhythm, tightens the muscles, redirects blood, shifts the immune system, narrows attention, and places comfort on hold. It does all this with ancient efficiency, often before the conscious self understands why. The modern human may believe they are reasoning their way through life, but again and again the body reveals a more complicated hierarchy. Beneath thought is command, beneath opinion is chemistry. Beneath the polished surface of selfhood is a survival structure old enough to treat every significant threat, physical or symbolic, as a matter not of mood, but of mobilization. By the time a person says they are afraid, much has already taken place beneath language. The body has shifted, attention has narrowed, the world has been divided into what matters and what can wait. But fear is only part of the design. Pain belongs to the same hidden economy, and so does prediction. Together they form one of the most severe and elegant features of the survival brain. It does not merely respond to injury or danger after the fact. It tries to anticipate them, rehearse them, and where possible prevent them. In that sense, some of the most uncomfortable experiences human beings endure are not signs that the system has failed. They are signs that the system is working exactly as a survival system was shaped to work, even when its logic makes ordinary life feel exhausting. This is not a comforting truth. Modern people often assume that the brain should be organized around happiness, clarity, balance, or self-expression. Yet those are fragile luxuries from an evolutionary perspective. The nervous system is not built first to make existence pleasant. It is built to keep the organism from being destroyed. If pleasantness helps, the brain permits it. If unease is safer, unease will be chosen. The result is a mind that can generate dread long before harm occurs, amplify discomfort to force attention, and replay old dangers with punishing fidelity so they are less likely to be forgotten. What feels cruel from the inside often has an ancient protective purpose. Fear, in this light, is not simply an emotion. It is a predictive state. It is the brain's way of preparing for a possible future that has not yet arrived. A person standing at the edge of a high place may feel the body recoil before any fall begins. A parent waiting for a child who is late may experience a whole chain of bodily alarms before receiving any bad news. A patient awaiting test results may feel fear, not because the outcome is known, but because the survival brain has already begun simulating what loss, illness, incapacity, or death might mean. The danger exists partly in imagination, but imagination here is not fantasy in the ordinary sense. It is rehearsal. The brain is running possible futures in advance, because organisms that anticipate may survive better than those that wait passively for confirmation. Prediction is one of the nervous system's most powerful tools. It allows the brain to prepare before contact, to organize the body around what is likely, and to learn from patterns that repeat. Yet prediction also creates much of human suffering. Once the brain becomes good at forecasting pain, it can begin living inside pains that have not happened. It can brace for rejection before the conversation begins. It can anticipate failure before the attempt. It can turn uncertainty into a prolonged physiological occupation. This is not because the brain is irrational in some simple way. It is because a system designed to minimize catastrophic surprise must sometimes accept the burden of chronic expectation. Pain works through a similar logic, though people often misunderstand it as a clean signal from damaged tissue to conscious awareness. In reality, pain is not merely damage felt. It is an interpretation built by the brain from many sources' sensory information, prior experience, expectation, attention, emotional context, and the estimated need to protect the body. This does not mean pain is imaginary. It means pain is strategic. The brain does not ask only whether tissue is harmed. It also asks whether protection, withdrawal, immobility, or caution are needed. The pain a person feels is shaped by that wider survival calculation. This becomes clear in the odd inconsistencies of bodily experience. A severe wound may initially produce little pain in the middle of immediate danger, while a minor injury can become almost intolerable when the threat has passed and attention turns inward. Soldiers have walked on shattered limbs. Athletes have continued through injuries that only later reveal their seriousness. At the same time, chronic pain conditions can persist even when tissue damage is minimal or no longer obvious. None of this fits comfortably with the simple idea that pain is a passive alarm wired directly to injury. What survives in the evidence suggests something more complicated and more unsettling. Pain is part of a protective prediction system, and the brain can produce it in proportion not only to what has happened, but to what it thinks might happen next. That predictive quality is deeply ancient. A creature that fails to protect an injured limb may lose it. A creature that resumes ordinary behavior too quickly after harm may die from what should have been survivable. Pain, therefore, does something forceful and effective. It narrows the world. It demands attention. It changes movement. It alters priorities. It makes ordinary actions feel costly, so that healing, caution, or withdrawal become more likely. The subjective unpleasantness is not an accidental side effect. It is the mechanism. If pain were mild, forgettable, or easy to ignore, it would protect poorly. Fear does something similar on a larger horizon. It takes uncertain futures and gives them present weight. It encourages avoidance, hypervigilance, and rehearsal. In moderation, this is adaptive. A person who feels no fear near unstable ground, wild animals, hostile strangers, or obvious physical danger is not free in any admirable sense. They are vulnerable. Fear introduces friction between impulse and action. It says not yet, not here, not with these odds. It keeps people alive long enough to become old enough for other goals. The problem, of course, is that the same system can become overgenerous with its warnings. A brain tuned for survival is often willing to sacrifice comfort for caution. Better to make the organism miserable than dead. Better to produce a sleepless night before a possible threat than a calm night before a real one. Better to attach dread to a memory too strongly than not strongly enough. Across evolutionary time, these priorities are harsh, but sensible. In modern life, they can feel almost punitive. A person may know that an upcoming conversation is unlikely to destroy them, yet the body still prepares as if status loss, humiliation, abandonment, or exposure are survival-level events. In the long human past, some of those social injuries truly could threaten survival. The ancient system has not forgotten. This is where memory becomes inseparable from fear and pain. The brain does not store all experiences equally. Events associated with strong emotional or bodily states are often recorded with unusual force. The details may not be complete, and memory itself remains notoriously unstable. But certain fragments become difficult to dislodge. A smell, a location, a season, a pattern of light, a kind of silence, the way a door closes. The texture of waiting before impact, these can be bound to survival relevance and retrieved years later with disorienting intensity. The system is not trying to create a beautiful autobiography. It is tagging danger for future reference. One of the lesser-known consequences of this is that the brain often learns from near misses and from implication. not just from direct harm. A person does not need to be bitten to develop terror in the presence of a snake-like shape. They do not need to suffer the full worst outcome to begin anticipating it. Observed threat, social learning, accumulated warning, and repeated partial distress can all shape the predictive machinery. The brain listens to patterns, not only to disasters. That makes the system efficient, but it also makes it vulnerable to distortion. The evidence remains incomplete on the exact thresholds by which certain experiences become deeply encoded while others fade. Yet it is clear that surprise, uncertainty, helplessness, and bodily arousal all influence how strongly fear and pain are learned. This helps explain why anticipation can sometimes hurt almost as much as the event itself. Waiting for impact recruits the same systems that prepare for impact. A child hearing angry footsteps in the hallway may experience fear long before any direct confrontation begins. A person who has endured repeated instability may become hypersensitive not to catastrophe itself, but to the subtle signals that catastrophe may be approaching. In those moments, prediction becomes suffering. The brain is trying to get ahead of the threat, but in doing so, it pulls the body into a future that has not yet happened. No single explanation fully accounts for why some people recover from frightening experiences with relatively little lasting effect, while others become locked into patterns of intense anticipation. Genetics, development, environment, prior history, social support, bodily condition, and chance all appear to matter. But whatever the full explanation, the broad architecture remains visible. The survival brain is not content to wait for the world to reveal danger plainly. It would rather infer too much than too little. It would rather feel early than late. It would rather overprotect than underreact. This same logic shapes everyday discomfort in quieter ways. Embarrassment, for example, is not usually treated as a survival issue in modern conversation, yet it can produce heat, collapse, agitation, and obsessive mental replay out of all proportion to the objective event. From the perspective of the ancient social brain, this makes a grim kind of sense. Public failure, ridicule, and loss of standing once carried material risks. Shame and anticipatory fear help regulate behavior within the group. They discourage actions that might threaten belonging. Once again, the mechanism is unpleasant precisely because it needs to matter. A mild, forgettable embarrassment would not guide behavior nearly as effectively. The same principle extends to grief, dread, and longing. Loss hurts because attachment is biologically costly and biologically necessary. Separation produces pain because organisms that do not care when bonds are broken are less likely to protect those bonds. The survival system therefore recruits suffering in the service of preservation. Some of the most profound emotional experiences in human life are not ornamental additions to thought. They are part of the hidden architecture by which the brain prioritizes what must not be lost. Seen this way, the human condition becomes both sadder and more coherent. The mind that longs for ease is housed inside a system that treats ease as conditional. Relief is permitted when the world seems safe enough. Pleasure is permitted when no urgent contradiction interrupts it. But lurking beneath these better states is a machinery willing to withdraw them quickly if caution seems wiser. This does not mean joy, love, curiosity, or wonder are illusions. It means they exist under a watchful system that can suspend them when survival demands a different mood. And this is perhaps the most difficult part to accept. Much of what people most dislike in themselves, their anxiety, their painful sensitivity, their anticipatory dread, their inability to let certain dangers go, may not be evidence of weakness at all. It may be the cost of carrying a predictive organ refined by deep time to care more about staying alive than about feeling at peace. The suffering can become excessive, even disabling. It can misfire, distort, and trap a person in false futures. But its roots are not arbitrary. They lie in a survival system that uses fear to prepare, pain to protect, and prediction to outrun disaster by imagining it first. The hidden survival system is not built to reassure. It is built to notice what might go wrong, and that bias shapes nearly every human life more deeply than people like to admit. Safety, in the brain's terms, is not a default condition that disappears only when danger arrives. It is something that must be actively recognized, confirmed, and maintained. If the evidence is mixed, the system often prefers caution. If the signals are ambiguous, it lacons toward vigilance. And because so much of modern life is made of uncertainty, abstraction, and social interpretation, many people live in bodies that are waiting for clarity that never fully comes. This helps explain one of the strangest features of the human mind. Danger often feels more convincing than safety. A single critical look can outweigh 10 neutral ones. One delayed reply can eclipse an entire history of ordinary conversation. A small bodily sensation can suddenly seem like the beginning of catastrophe. An unresolved problem can grow until it occupies the whole horizon of thought. These are not simply bad habits of attention, though they can become habitual. They are expressions of a nervous system shaped by asymmetric stakes. To mistake safety for danger is costly. To mistake danger for safety can be final. Across evolutionary time, that difference leaves the system suspicious. The result is a brain that is often more skilled at detecting trouble than absorbing calm. Bad news lands quickly. Good news is frequently provisional. Threat has edges. Safety can feel vague, conditional, and easy to lose. Even pleasure is often scanned for what may interrupt it. A quiet evening can be invaded by anticipatory worry. A loving relationship can be shadowed by the possibility of abandonment. Success can be followed not by rest but by fear of losing status. In this sense, the survival brain does not merely react to danger, it casts danger forward into the future, using uncertainty as raw material. Modern life gives it endless opportunities to do so. For most of human history, many threats are immediate and concrete: a predator, an enemy, a storm, a failing crop, an infection, a dangerous crossing, a hostile group nearby. These are terrible problems, but they are at least problems the body can organize around. They have location, timing, and often some visible source. Contemporary threats are often stranger. Debt is a threat without clause. Reputation can collapse at a distance. A person can lose sleep over data, schedules, unread messages, bureaucratic decisions, or opinions forming in invisible rooms. The body, however, is ancient enough to treat uncertainty itself as a meaningful warning. It does not need a tiger in the grass if it has 1,000 small ambiguities and no clear signal that the danger has passed. This is why abstract threats can feel physically real. A financial worry can tighten the chest. Social exclusion can create genuine pain. Waiting for news can become nausea, tremor, exhaustion, and shallow breathing. From the outside, this can seem disproportionate. Nothing is attacking the body directly. No wound has opened. No predator is present. Yet the system is responding to something that, in ancestral terms, may indeed have implied real danger: instability, exposure, powerlessness, possible loss of shelter, resources, alliance, or rank. The physical body does not always distinguish cleanly between symbolic and material danger because, across much of human history, the symbolic often had material consequences. There is a dry and uncomfortable logic here. The brain does not need to be objective in order to be adaptive. It needs to be sufficiently protective. That means it often relies on shortcuts, exaggerations, and pattern completion. A silence becomes rejection. A delay becomes threat. A minor symptom becomes illness. A moment of awkwardness becomes social collapse. These interpretations can be wrong, sometimes spectacularly wrong. But the system is not designed to preserve emotional elegance. It is designed to prepare the organism quickly enough that, if the danger turns out to be real, it is not starting from rest. This is one reason false alarms are so common. The survival brain would rather inconvenience the person than fail them. It would rather flood the body with unease than risk missing the signs of a genuine problem. In evolutionary terms, this strategy can work well. In psychological terms, it can be exhausting. A person may live for years inside a state of intermittent alarm, reacting not to direct catastrophe, but to cues that resemble it, imply it, or merely refuse to rule it out. Safety remains elusive not because the world is always dangerous, but because the criteria for full bodily certainty are often stricter than the criteria for intellectual reassurance. Children reveal this logic with painful clarity. A child may know they are in their own home and still remain tense if voices in the next room carry the wrong tone. They may cling not because something terrible has happened, but because unpredictability itself is enough to unsettle the system. Adults often imagine they have outgrown this dependence on clear signals of safety, but the underlying need remains: predictable warmth, consistent attention, trustworthy patterns, recognizable faces, readable intentions, and environments that make sense to the body continue to matter. When those are absent, the nervous system may drift toward guardedness even if no obvious threat can be named. Scholars still debate how best to measure safety as a nervous system state rather than merely the absence of threat. But the distinction matters. A person can be objectively safe and still unable to feel safe. The body may remain unconvinced, the room may be locked, the danger long over, the evidence reassuring, yet the organism stays on alert because it has learned that appearances are not enough. What survives in the evidence suggests that safety must often be experienced through repeated, embodied confirmation before the deeper system loosens its grip. Information alone is sometimes too weak. The body wants pattern, consistency, and time. This helps explain why modern advice so often feels inadequate. Telling someone not to worry assumes the problem is a mistaken thought. Often the problem is a state of vigilance that thought alone cannot dissolve. The person may fully understand that their fear is exaggerated and still be unable to stop scanning, bracing, checking, imagining, and preparing. Their survival system is not asking whether the fear is philosophically justified. It is asking whether uncertainty has been resolved to a degree sufficient for deactivation. If the answer remains unclear, the alarm lingers. The brain's relationship with uncertainty may be the crucial point. Certainty, even unpleasant certainty, can sometimes feel easier to bear than ambiguity. A known problem allows the system to organize. An unknown possibility keeps it circling. This is why waiting can be so punishing. Waiting for test results, for a reply, for judgment, for a door to open, for footsteps, for the outcome of a conversation. For the first sign of whether one still belongs, all of these can be harder on the nervous system than action itself. The threat has no clean boundary. It cannot be fought, escaped, or fully understood. It simply occupies attention. The body remains half-prepared, and half-prepared states are among the most exhausting states a human can inhabit. There is also the matter of memory. Once the system has been repeatedly taught that safety is unstable, it may begin treating ordinary calm as temporary and therefore untrustworthy. Peace becomes suspicious. Quiet feels like the pause before impact. Good fortune feels precarious. A person may seem negative or overly cautious from the outside when what is really happening is that their prediction systems have learned not to settle too deeply into relief. The evidence remains incomplete on exactly how different experiences alter these thresholds over time, but the pattern is familiar across many lives. Repeated unpredictability makes certainty harder to believe. The culture surrounding a person can intensify this. In environments defined by competition, surveillance, volatility, and constant evaluation, the brain receives very few signals that it can safely switch out of defensive mode. Notifications, deadlines, reputational risk, shifting norms, economic precarity, public performance, and endless exposure to crisis all feed ancient mechanisms that evolved under very different conditions. No single explanation fully accounts for the modern epidemic of unease, but the mismatch is difficult to ignore. The survival system was shaped to respond to identifiable danger, recover, and return to baseline. Many people now live in worlds that stimulate the first part of that sequence and interrupt the second. Yet the brain's caution is not mere pathology. It is also part of what keeps human beings from drifting carelessly into harm. Suspicion protects, anticipation protects. The discomfort of uncertainty can motivate preparation, caution, and repair. A person who notices social tension may avert conflict. A person who feels dread before entering a dangerous place may avoid real harm. A parent who wakes at a small sound may save a child. The same system that produces anxiety can also produce vigilance that matters. The problem is not that it exists. The problem is that it is difficult to calibrate in environments where the threats are often diffuse, chronic, and psychologically loaded. So safety can feel elusive not because the person is broken, but because the system evaluating safety is old, conservative, and operating under a rule that has served life for a very long time. When in doubt, prepare. That rule makes enormous sense in forests, storms, tribal conflict, famine, and physical vulnerability. It also survives into office politics, medical uncertainty, romantic ambiguity, social media exposure, and private fears about futures that have not arrived. The organism still behaves as though preparation might be the difference between continuity and collapse. The human cost is that people often mistake this ancient caution for personal failure. They think they should be able to reason themselves into calm, should be able to trust more quickly, should be able to tolerate uncertainty without the body turning against them. But the body is not turning against them. It is doing what old survival systems do when the world refuses to become fully legible. It scans, it predicts, it keeps the gates only partly open. It lets safety in slowly and lets danger in immediately. And so the survival brain remains watchful even in ordinary life, not because every ordinary life is secretly catastrophic, but because ambiguity itself has always been dangerous enough to deserve respect. It is easier for the nervous system to believe in risk than in peace, easier to mobilize than to fully release, easier to prepare than to be surprised. That is why safety, though deeply desired, can feel so difficult to inhabit. The hidden system inside the brain is not looking for comfort as its highest aim. It is looking for evidence strong enough to justify lowering the guard, and for many human beings, in many settings, that evidence never feels quite complete. Long before a person can explain the world, the hidden survival system is already studying it. It studies rhythm before language, tone before meaning, presence before principle. It learns from footsteps, pauses, temperature, tension in the air, the reliability of touch, the timing of comfort, the predictability of return. Childhood is often remembered later through stories, photographs, milestones, and obvious events. But the deeper survival brain is keeping a different kind of record. It is not building a neat narrative of what happened. It is calibrating itself to what kind of world this seems to be and what kind of body it must become in order to live there. This is one of the most consequential things the brain ever does. In early life, the survival system is not fully formed in any final sense. It is highly plastic, exquisitely sensitive to patterns, and dependent on the environment for signals that help define what counts as normal. A child does not simply inherit a fixed alarm system and then use it unchanged. The broad architecture may be ancient, but the thresholds, expectations, and reflexive responses are shaped by experience. The young brain asks again and again, in the only way it can when distress appears, does anyone come? When uncertainty rises, does it settle? When fear floods the body, is it met by steadiness or by more fear? When the world becomes confusing, does it become understandable again? The answers are not stored as philosophy, they are stored as regulation. A child who is repeatedly soothed learns one set of bodily expectations. A child who is repeatedly ignored, frightened, or forced to manage overwhelming states alone learns another. In one case, the nervous system begins to treat safety as something that can be restored. In the other, it may begin to assume that alarm must be endured without reliable rescue. The difference can shape attention, sleep, trust, memory, social behavior, and the sense of whether calm is a stable state or only a fragile accident. This is why early life matters even when no dramatic catastrophe occurs. The survival brain is not shaped only by spectacular trauma. It is also shaped by repetition, by climate, by ordinary patterns that occur so often they become invisible to the adults producing them. A household may contain no violence and still remain deeply dysregulating if it is unpredictable, emotionally cold, chronically tense, or impossible for a child to read. Another may be materially modest or difficult in obvious ways, and still foster resilience if fear is met consistently with reassurance and distress is not treated as abandonment. What survives in the evidence suggests that the nervous system is sensitive not only to events, but to patterns of response. The question is not merely what happens to the child, it is also what happens next. This is where attachment enters the story. Though the word is sometimes used too lightly in modern conversation, at its biological core, attachment is not sentimental. It is survival logic. Human children are unusually dependent for unusually long periods. They cannot feed, protect, regulate, or orient themselves independently in the early phases of life. They require not just food and shelter, but nervous systems around them that help organize their own. A calm adult can lower a child's alarm. A hostile adult can raise it. A responsive caregiver can teach the body that distress moves toward resolution. An inconsistent one can teach the opposite. In this sense, childhood is not merely a time when the brain learns about the world. It is a time when the brain learns what kind of world the body should prepare for. One of the more surprising details is how indirect some of this learning can be. Children are not only responding to how adults treat them personally, they are also reading the broader emotional weather. A child in a house where nobody speaks openly but everyone is tense may become exquisitely sensitive to silence. A child in an environment where affection and anger arrive without warning may learn to scan faces with unusual intensity. A child exposed to repeated conflict may become a specialist in early signs of escalation, noticing shifts in voice or posture long before others do. These adaptations can look like maturity, sensitivity, or difficult temperament depending on who is observing. In reality, they may be survival skills acquired early, often at a price. The price is that the nervous system begins to organize itself around what it has had to predict. If comfort is inconsistent, vigilance may become the safer default. If danger appears suddenly, readiness may harden into habit. If emotional needs are dismissed or mocked, the body may learn that visibility is risky and silence is protective. If affection is entangled with volatility, closeness itself may become a confusing mixture of desire and alarm. None of this requires conscious decision. The child does not sit down and choose a world view. The body learns first. Years later, the adult may simply experience these patterns as personality. This is one of the great concealments of the survival system. It can turn adaptation into identity. A person may describe themselves as naturally anxious, distant, overly sensitive, independent, suspicious, eager to please, numb under pressure, or unable to relax, without realizing how much of that style may reflect early calibration rather than fixed essence. Scholars still debate how best to separate temperament, genetics, and environmental shaping in these outcomes, and the evidence remains incomplete in many cases, but the broad conclusion is difficult to avoid. Childhood does not merely fill the mind with memories, it helps tune the body's expectations about safety, threat, rescue, intimacy, and control. Stress plays a central role here, but again not in the simplistic way it is sometimes presented. Short bursts of manageable stress in the presence of support can be tolerated and even instructive. They teach recovery. They teach that alarm is survivable and that the system can return to baseline. Chronic, overwhelming, or unpredictable stress is different. It can push the young brain toward persistent hypervigilance, heightened startle, sleep disruption, emotional volatility, or shutdown. If activation becomes too frequent and resolution too rare, the survival system may begin treating high alert as ordinary. Calm then feels unfamiliar, and unfamiliarity itself can be unsettling. The opposite pattern can emerge as well. Not every child under strain becomes visibly anxious or explosive. Some move toward numbness, compliance, dissociation, or early self-silencing. From the outside, this can look impressively mature. The child is quiet, self-contained, undemanding, uncomplaining. Yet beneath that stillness there may be a nervous system that has learned that expression does not bring help, that need is dangerous, or that the safest strategy is to reduce one's own presence. The survival system is adaptive in more than one direction. It can become louder, or it can disappear behind a mask of calm. Neither state necessarily reflects true ease. This matters because later life often rewards the appearance while missing the cost. The person who never asked for much may be praised for being easy. The person who reads everyone else's moods may be admired for empathy. The person who stays functional in crisis may be seen as impressively strong. Sometimes those qualities are indeed strengths. Sometimes they are also traces of an early world in which the body learned that survival depended on anticipating others, suppressing self, or becoming useful before becoming known. No single explanation fully accounts for any individual life, but these patterns recur too often to be dismissed as coincidence. There is also the question of memory, and here childhood is particularly deceptive. People often assume that if they cannot recall early events clearly, those events have little continuing power. The survival system does not work that way. Much of its most important learning is non-verbal, procedural, and embodied. A person may have no explicit memory of repeated childhood tension and still live with a body that braces automatically, scans tone compulsively, or struggles to settle in intimacy. The record exists, but it is written less in narrative than in thresholds. How quickly does the heart race? How hard is it to trust reassurance? How much ambiguity can be tolerated? How long does it take the body to believe that danger has passed? The social world of childhood is especially important because human survival has always depended so heavily on belonging. A child does not experience rejection, ridicule, neglect, or humiliation as mere inconveniences. The nervous system is organized to treat them seriously. For a dependent organism, loss of connection is not abstract. It threatens access to protection itself. This is why shame can be so violent, why exclusion can feel physically painful, and why the tone of family life can shape the body so deeply. The ancient social brain is learning, from the beginning, whether other people are mainly refuge, confusion, danger, or some unstable combination of all three. What makes this especially haunting is that many of these early calibrations are adaptive in context. The hyper-aware child in a volatile home is not broken. The compliant child in a punitive environment is not weak. The withdrawn child in an emotionally barren world is not defective. Each may be doing something intelligent with the information available. The tragedy is not the adaptation itself. The tragedy is that the adaptation may persist long after the original conditions have changed. The adult then carries an ancient map into a new terrain, reading ordinary uncertainty as greater threat than it is, or failing to expect care even when care is genuinely present. And yet childhood calibration is not destiny. The same plasticity that allows the early world to shape the system also leaves room, however uneven, for later revision, new relationships, repeated safety, therapy, ritual, community, bodily regulation, and time can all contribute to changing thresholds that once seemed permanent, but such change tends to be slower than insight. A person may understand their past long before their nervous system stops reacting, as though the past is still current. Information can open the door. Repetition often convinces the body to walk through it. This is why compassion matters so much in any honest account of the survival brain. The patterns formed in childhood are often judged morally or aesthetically before they are understood biologically. People are called difficult, clingy, cold, dramatic, aloof, overly independent, too much, not enough. But beneath many of these labels is a nervous system that learned early what it thought was necessary in order to preserve connection, avoid harm, or remain bearable to others. The evidence suggests that early life does not simply influence later behavior at the level of opinion or attitude. It helps shape the hidden machinery that decides what feels safe, what feels risky, and what kinds of selfhood seem survivable. So the ancient world inside childhood is not ancient because it happened long ago in calendar terms. It is ancient because it speaks the language of the old survival brain: proximity, unpredictability, alarm, comfort, exile, repair. It belongs to the same deep logic that once governed the fate of small human groups in dangerous landscapes. A child enters the world with a nervous system waiting to be instructed. The instruction may come gently or harshly, clearly or chaotically, either way. The lesson sinks below thought, and long after the scenes themselves are forgotten, the body may still be living by what it learned there. Not everything that matters to the survival brain is stored in a way that can be easily told. Some experiences vanish almost completely, dissolving into the background of ordinary forgetting. Others remain with a strange persistence, returning not as clear stories but as fragments, sensations, flashes, or moods that seem to arrive from nowhere. This unevenness is not random. It reflects how the brain prioritizes what must be remembered in order to prevent future harm. Memory, in this system, is not an archive built for accuracy. It is a tool shaped for survival, and like all such tools, it sacrifices completeness for usefulness. The brain does not record every moment equally because it cannot afford to. Most of life is uneventful in terms of survival. Repetitive, safe, predictable experiences do not need to be stored in detail. What matters more are the moments that signal danger, surprise, pain, or intense emotional relevance. These are the moments that demand learning. These are the moments that may need to be avoided or managed differently next time. So the survival system marks them, strengthens them, and makes them easier to retrieve. This is why certain memories feel almost indestructible. A person may forget what they ate last week, but remember with startling clarity the tone of a voice during an argument years ago. They may not recall the details of an ordinary day, but can instantly relive the moment something went wrong. The brain is not being selective in a sentimental way. It is being selective in a protective way. It keeps what might matter again. But what it keeps is not always a complete or reliable record. Memory is reconstructive. Each time it is recalled, it is reshaped, influenced by current context, emotion, and expectation. Scholars still debate how much of any given memory reflects the original event versus later reinterpretation, and the evidence remains incomplete. What is clear is that the survival system does not require perfect accuracy to function. It requires patterns. If a pattern suggests risk, it is enough to influence future behavior. This becomes especially important in the case of emotionally intense experiences, under conditions of strong fear, stress, or pain. The brain's encoding processes change, attention narrows, certain details become highly salient, while others are ignored. The memory that forms may be vivid but incomplete, focused on specific sensory or emotional elements rather than a coherent narrative. Later, those elements can be triggered by cues that resemble the original context, even if the person does not consciously connect the two. This is one way to understand trauma, though the term is often used broadly. In its more precise sense, trauma involves an experience that overwhelms the brain's ability to process and integrate what is happening. The survival system takes over, prioritizing immediate response over orderly memory formation. The result can be a kind of fragmentation. Instead of being stored as a past event with a beginning and an end, the experience may remain partially unprocessed, ready to be reactivated by reminders that the brain interprets as relevant. A sound, a smell, a visual pattern, a bodily sensation, even a particular kind of silence can act as a trigger. When this happens, the person may not simply remember the event. They may feel as though it is happening again. The body reacts as if the past is present. Heart rate rises, muscles tense, attention narrows, and the sense of time can shift. The thinking mind may struggle to reconcile this reaction with the current environment, leading to confusion or distress from the outside. It can look like an overreaction. From the inside, it is a survival system responding to what it believes is a recurring threat. This does not mean that all strong memories are traumatic or that all triggers produce extreme reactions. The system operates on a spectrum. Even relatively mild but repeated experiences can create conditioned responses. A person who repeatedly feels judged in certain social situations may develop anxiety in similar contexts, even if no explicit harm occurs. The brain learns associations. It links cues with outcomes, and once those links are established, they can influence behavior automatically. Conditioning is one of the most efficient mechanisms the survival system uses. It allows the brain to respond quickly without re-evaluating every situation from scratch. If a certain pattern has led to discomfort or danger before, it is safer to treat it as significant again. This can be adaptive when the pattern is accurate. It can become limiting when the pattern is too broad or no longer relevant. A person who once needed to be constantly alert may continue to scan for threat in environments that are relatively safe. The body does not easily forget what it has learned to treat as important. One of the more subtle consequences of this system is that it can create layers of response. A person may react not only to the present situation, but also to the memory of past reactions. For example, someone who has experienced panic may begin to fear the sensations of panic themselves. A racing heart becomes not just a signal, but a threat. This can create feedback loops where the anticipation of a reaction contributes to the reaction, which then reinforces the anticipation. The survival system trying to protect ends up amplifying the very state it is trying to avoid. Memory also interacts with imagination in ways that can blur the boundary between past and future. The same neural systems involved in recalling events are used to simulate possible outcomes. This means that remembered danger can easily inform imagined danger. A person who has experienced loss may find it easier to imagine losing again. A person who has been hurt may anticipate being hurt in similar ways. This is not simply pessimism. It is the brain using available data to predict what might happen next. Yet memory is not only a source of fear, it is also a source of resilience. Just as the brain stores patterns of danger, it can store patterns of safety, recovery, and support. A person who has experienced reliable comfort may find it easier to return to calm after stress. Positive experiences, especially when repeated and emotionally meaningful, can help balance the system. However, the bias toward threat means that these positive patterns often require more repetition to have the same impact as a single intense negative event. This imbalance can make it seem as though the brain is unfair, holding on to pain more tightly than pleasure. In a sense, it is. But from a survival perspective, this bias is understandable. Forgetting a safe moment is rarely dangerous. Forgetting a dangerous one can be. The system is weighted accordingly. There is also the question of how memory is integrated over time. Not all experiences remain fixed in their original form. Through reflection, conversation, and new experiences, memories can be reinterpreted and recontextualized. This process can reduce their emotional intensity and change how they influence behavior. However, this integration is not automatic. It often requires conditions of safety, attention, and sometimes deliberate effort. Without these, certain memories may remain active, continuing to shape perception and response long after the original context has changed. What survives in the record suggests that the survival brain treats memory less as a static storehouse and more as an active system of guidance. It is constantly updating, reinforcing, and sometimes distorting its own contents based on what seems most relevant to current conditions. This makes it powerful but also unpredictable. The same memory can feel distant one day and immediate the next, depending on what cues are present and how the body is already positioned. In this way, memory becomes a bridge between past and present, not always in a way that serves conscious intention. It carries forward lessons that may no longer apply, yet still influence behavior. It can warn, protect, and guide. But it can also confine, repeating patterns that limit new possibilities. The survival system does not distinguish between helpful and unhelpful persistence. It preserves what it believes is important, leaving the task of reinterpretation to the slower, more reflective parts of the mind. This creates a tension that runs through much of human experience. The past is never entirely past in the body. It is stored in patterns of response, in what is noticed and what is ignored, in what feels safe and what does not. Understanding this does not immediately change it, but it can make the patterns more visible. It can reveal that what feels like an irrational reaction may have a history, even if that history is not fully accessible in words. So memory, in the survival system, is not just about remembering. It is about preparing. It is about carrying forward the traces of what has mattered, shaping how the present is interpreted and how the future is anticipated. It is uneven, selective, and sometimes misleading. But it is never neutral. It is one of the main ways the hidden survival system extends its influence across time, turning past experience into present expectation, and ensuring that what once threatened the organism continues to inform how it moves through the world. When people talk about survival responses, they usually name only two: fight or flight. The phrases are so familiar that they sound almost complete, as though the body has only two ancient options when danger arrives: confront it or escape it. But the hidden survival system is older, stranger, and far less tidy than that. A living organism does not survive by relying on one pair of reactions. It survives by having a range of strategies, many of them automatic, many of them deeply misunderstood, and some of them so counterintuitive that from the outside they can look like weakness, irrationality, or even betrayal of the self. In reality, they are often the last available moves of a nervous system trying to preserve life under impossible conditions. Fight is the most legible response because it satisfies human ideas about strength. The body surges toward action, muscles tighten, pain may narrow or disappear. Attention fixes on the source of threat. Anger rises, not as a moral failure but as a useful state that suppresses hesitation and increases willingness to act. In the right circumstances, this is exactly what survival demands. A cornered animal does not debate. A human being under direct assault may discover a force, speed, or clarity they did not know they possessed. Fight is ancient because sometimes the path to continued existence runs directly through resistance. Flight is equally obvious in its logic. If escape is possible, distance is protection. The body prepares accordingly. Legs are primed, breathing quickens, visual attention shifts toward routes and openings, and energy is mobilized for movement rather than prolonged engagement. Fear is especially useful here because it makes staying feel intolerable. It pushes the organism away from the source of threat before the cost of delay becomes irreversible. In evolutionary terms, this is often the most efficient solution. Not every danger should be defeated. Many are better survived by absence. Yet neither fight nor flight explains what many people actually do under extreme stress. Sometimes the body does not surge into action, it stops. The limbs feel heavy or unresponsive. The voice vanishes. Thought fragments or narrows into useless loops. A person may remain still, silent, detached, or physically unable to move with the speed they later imagine they should have had. This is freeze, and it is one of the most commonly misunderstood survival states, because it resembles helplessness. People often judge it harshly, especially in themselves. But freeze is not the absence of a survival response, it is a survival response. In many species, freezing has clear adaptive value. Motion attracts attention. Stillness can interrupt detection. A predator tracking movement may miss prey that becomes abruptly motionless. Even when concealment is imperfect, freezing can provide a fraction of time for reassessment. It allows the organism to stop broadcasting itself and gather more information before committing to a costly action. In humans, freeze may appear as physical immobility, speech arrest, intense stillness, dissociation, or the baffling inability to do obvious things that later seem simple. The nervous system is not failing in these moments. It is shifting into a state that may once have increased the odds of survival when overt action was too risky or too uncertain. There is also a deeper form of shutdown, sometimes described as collapse or tonic immobility. This state is even more disturbing because it can look less like readiness than surrender. The body may become limp, numb, disconnected, or profoundly passive. Awareness can narrow in strange ways. Time may feel distorted, sensation may dull. A person may later describe watching events happen from far away, or feeling as though they were no longer fully inside themselves. This is among the most difficult survival states to understand from a civilized distance, because it violates cherished ideas about agency. But what survives in the biological record suggests that under extreme threat, especially when escape and resistance appear impossible, shutdown can become the final strategy. Among animals, tonic immobility has been observed in many forms. It may reduce injury by lowering struggle, interrupt predatory behavior in certain circumstances, or provide a last-ditch survival advantage when no other option remains. In humans, the picture is more complicated and scholars still debate the full mechanisms involved, but the pattern is familiar enough to matter. People in overwhelming danger do not always become visibly heroic. Sometimes the nervous system drops them into immobility, numbing, or dissociation precisely because overwhelming activation cannot be sustained and no effective action seems available. This is not consent. It is not choice. It is not moral failure. It is an ancient protective logic taking over where modern ideas of deliberate control can no longer govern events. Dissociation belongs in this landscape as well. It is one of the strangest capacities of the human brain, and one of the clearest signs that survival sometimes requires distance, not from the threat itself, but from the full subjective impact of the threat. Under certain conditions, the mind can separate aspects of experience from ordinary conscious integration. Perception becomes unreal. The body feels distant. Emotion disappears or becomes unreachable. Memory may fragment. This can happen in moments of acute terror, chronic stress, pain, overwhelming helplessness, or environments where direct emotional experience would be too costly to carry all at once. From the outside, dissociation can be mistaken for indifference. From the inside, it is often the nervous system's way of reducing unbearable contact with what is happening. Another response, less discussed in older scientific language but increasingly recognized in popular discourse, is what many people now call fawn. The term can be clumsy, but it points to something real, the survival strategy of appeasement, when danger is social, relational, or tied to power differences. The safest move may be to placate, comply, soothe, flatter, or make oneself useful to the source of threat. This is not the same as genuine trust or affection. It is a highly adaptive reading of conditions. If resistance will provoke more harm and escape is impossible, then reducing the other person's aggression may be the best available path. Human beings, as deeply social mammals, are especially capable of this kind of survival intelligence. Appeasement can be subtle. A child in a volatile household becomes unusually good at predicting adult moods and adjusting accordingly. An employee under domineering authority learns to soften, agree, disappear, or become indispensable. A person in a coercive relationship may smile, reassure, calm, and accommodate while experiencing profound internal alarm. Later, these patterns may survive into safer contexts, where they are mistaken for kindness, agreeableness, or excessive dependence. Sometimes they are indeed woven into those traits. Sometimes they are older than personality, rooted in a nervous system that once learned that survival depended on staying connected to power while minimizing the risk of provoking it. This wider map of responses changes how human behavior should be read. A trembling person who cannot speak is not necessarily weak. A compliant person in danger is not necessarily consenting. A child who becomes eerily calm in chaos is not necessarily resilient in the healthy sense. A person who leaves their own body in moments of terror is not inventing drama. Much of what looks irrational becomes intelligible once survival is understood as flexible rather than noble. The body does not respond according to ideals. It responds according to probabilities, constraints, and ancient strategies shaped by situations in which no good options may exist. One of the lesser-known complexities here is that these states can shift rapidly or overlap. A person may begin in freeze, burst suddenly into flight, collapse afterward into shutdown, and later replay the event with self-accusing questions about why they did not fight sooner. Another may move from appeasement to explosive anger once the nervous system senses an opening. Another may remain outwardly composed while inwardly cycling through panic and numbness. The survival system does not honor the categories people later use to describe it. It is dynamic, opportunistic, and often contradictory because danger itself is dynamic, opportunistic, and contradictory. This is why shame so often follows survival. Modern consciousness judges ancient responses using standards they were never designed to meet. People ask why they did not scream, run faster, hit back, think clearly, leave sooner, remember more, or feel less. These questions can haunt a person for years, yet beneath them lies a misunderstanding of what the nervous system was doing. It was not staging a moral performance, it was attempting, with whatever options seemed available, to preserve life, reduce harm, or endure what could not be escaped. The evidence remains incomplete on why one response dominates in one person and a different one in another, though development, history, physiology, and the specifics of the threat all seem to matter, but no single explanation fully accounts for the outcome in every case, and that uncertainty should invite humility rather than judgment. There is a broader historical irony here. Human cultures tend to admire active forms of survival and mistrust passive ones. The fighter is celebrated. The escapee is respected. The frozen, compliant, or dissociated survivor is often left with confusion and self-contempt. But biology is less sentimental. It cares about survival, not narrative dignity. If stillness works, stillness is selected. If numbness allows endurance, numbness is used. If dependence on the aggressor reduces harm in the short term, the system may move toward connection where an outsider expects hatred. The old brain is not interested in preserving a person's later sense of coherence. It is interested in getting them through the event. And these patterns do not end when the danger ends. The body can carry them forward into ordinary life. Freeze may become chronic hesitation, blankness under pressure, or the inability to access language in conflict. Flight may become restlessness, overwork, compulsive movement, or inability to stay still long enough to feel. Fight may reappear as irritability, sharp defensiveness, or the reflex to control every uncertain situation. Appeasement may become self-erasure in relationships. Shutdown may become depression, numbness, or the strange conviction that nothing is quite real enough to matter. What once protected the organism can outlive its original usefulness and begin shaping a whole style of existence. Yet even here, the story is not one of defect. It is one of adaptation extended beyond its proper setting. The nervous system learned responses under conditions it treated as serious, and it does not easily abandon them merely because the conscious mind now has better arguments. A person may understand perfectly well that they are safe, and still find their body freezing in confrontation, pleasing authority, dissociating in intimacy, or fleeing any situation that resembles old danger. The body remembers strategy long after the battlefield has changed. To see this clearly is to recover a measure of compassion that survival states are rarely granted. The hidden system inside the brain is not only more complex than fight or flight, it is more tragic and more intelligent. It contains options for action, concealment, surrender, disconnection, and appeasement because life has always required more than bravery. Sometimes it requires stillness. Sometimes it requires disappearance. Sometimes it requires the terrible flexibility of enduring what cannot be defeated in the moment. And once that is understood, many human reactions that seemed shameful begin to look like what they often are: ancient adaptive moves, written into flesh long before reason arrived to judge them. For most of human history, survival is never purely individual. A lone human being is a fragile thing. The body is vulnerable to weather, injury, hunger, exhaustion, and attack. But it is equally vulnerable to something less visible and no less serious separation. To be cut off from others in the ancient world is not merely to feel sad. It is to lose protection, information, shared labor, status, mating opportunity, care in illness, and the thousands of small advantages that make a weak primate capable of enduring harsh landscapes. The hidden survival system inside the brain knows this at a level deeper than argument. It treats belonging as safety, it treats exclusion as danger, and because of that, some of the most painful human experiences are social long before they are philosophical. This is one of the reasons humiliation can burn with such disproportionate force. A person may know, rationally, that an awkward moment at a table or a public mistake at work is not equivalent to death. Yet the body can react as though something much larger is at stake. Heat rises in the face, the stomach drops, the chest tightens, the mind begins replaying the scene with merciless intensity. Sleep may grow lighter, appetite may shift. Attention becomes captive to what others might now be thinking. From the outside, this can appear absurdly dramatic. From the perspective of the old social brain, it is perfectly legible. Public damage to standing once carried real material risks. To be laughed at, cast out, distrusted, or lowered in rank could alter access to resources and protection. The body has not forgotten that logic. Loneliness belongs in the same category. Modern language often treats loneliness as a soft emotional condition, a kind of sadness that can be solved with distraction or attitude. Yet the evidence suggests the brain processes isolation with extraordinary seriousness. Separation from reliable social contact changes stress signaling, sleep, vigilance, and even perception. People who feel chronically isolated often become more alert to signs of rejection, more likely to interpret ambiguity as threat, and more difficult to calm. This is not weakness of character. It is a survival system registering the absence of something it evolved to require. A nervous system built in small interdependent groups does not easily interpret prolonged disconnection as neutral. The infant makes this truth stark. A human child cannot survive alone, and the nervous system develops accordingly. The sound of a familiar voice, the sight of a known face, the predictability of touch, and the rhythm of mutual regulation become part of the body's understanding of safety itself. Adulthood layers complexity over that foundation, but it does not erase it. Even later in life, people do not merely think their way into calm, they often borrow it from others. A trusted presence can steady breathing, a warm tone can lower alarm, shared laughter can loosen muscles that fear had tightened. The body is social in its regulation. It was built that way because solitary self-sufficiency is largely a modern fantasy. This does not mean every human relationship is protective. Quite the opposite. Other people are among the greatest resources the survival system can access, and among the greatest threats it must monitor. The same species capable of care is also capable of deception, betrayal, ridicule, abandonment, and violence. This is why the social nervous system is so vigilant. Faces are scanned rapidly, voices are read for warmth or threat, status is tracked, group dynamics are monitored, approval, contempt, attention, neglect, and dominance all carry weight far beyond their surface appearance. The brain has good reason to care. In ancestral life, another person's intentions could change the entire structure of risk. Status, in particular, matters more than modern ideals of equality sometimes like to admit. Human beings are exquisitely sensitive to hierarchy. They notice who is admired, who is dismissed, who can interrupt, who must wait, who is allowed to take up space, who is punished for doing the same. Much of this tracking happens below explicit thought, yet it shapes stress and behavior continuously. A person entering a room does not simply see furniture and walls. They sense rank, permission, threat, attention, and possibility. The social brain is calculating where safety lies within the arrangement. Is it safer to speak, defer, charm, disappear, submit, align, challenge, or leave? These are ancient calculations wearing modern clothes. This helps explain why rejection can feel physically painful. Neurobiological evidence has long suggested overlap between the processing of physical pain and social pain, though scholars still debate the exact nature and degree of that overlap. The evidence remains incomplete in some details, but the broad pattern is hard to ignore. Exclusion, heartbreak, humiliation, and abandonment do not merely hurt in a metaphorical sense. They recruit the body. They can produce exhaustion, sleeplessness, agitation, nausea, heaviness, and an ache that feels disturbingly real because, in survival terms, it is real. The organism is responding to a rupture in one of its key protective systems. There is also a darker corollary. Because belonging matters so much, people will often endure extraordinary discomfort in order to preserve it. They will remain silent when speaking risks exclusion. They will imitate the group even when the group is wrong. They will tolerate cruelty from those on whom they depend. They will edit themselves for acceptance, perform loyalty, adopt shared fears, and sometimes participate in harm because being outside the circle feels more dangerous than compromising inside it. This is not a flattering picture of human nature, but it is an ancient one. The survival brain does not ask first whether belonging is morally pure. It asks whether belonging reduces risk. Much of human conformity begins here. The desire to fit in is not only vanity, it is partly biological caution. People monitor the emotional temperature of their tribe, whether the tribe is a family, village, workplace, religion, nation, or online crowd. They look for signs that they remain legible and acceptable within it. A sudden shift in norms can be profoundly destabilizing because it threatens that legibility. What was safe to say yesterday becomes dangerous today. What signaled belonging becomes grounds for suspicion. The social nervous system reacts intensely to these shifts because unpredictability inside the group is a special kind of danger. It undermines the very network on which regulation depends. One of the lesser-known consequences of this is that conflict with loved ones can be more physiologically destabilizing than conflict with strangers. A harsh exchange with someone unimportant may sting and then fade. A slight change in tone from a trusted partner, parent, sibling, or close friend can flood the body with disproportionate alarm. The reason is simple and ancient. The more necessary the bond, the more seriously its possible rupture is treated. The survival system does not weight all relationships equally. It invests more where dependency, attachment, and identity are entwined. That is why intimate relationships can be both the deepest source of comfort and the sharpest source of dysregulation. What survives in the evidence suggests that co-regulation is one of the central, underappreciated facts of human life. People often speak as though maturity means becoming able to regulate oneself in total isolation, but that ideal does not match the biology well. Human beings calm each other, disturb each other, and organize each other's nervous systems in continuous subtle ways. A room full of anxious people becomes hard to breathe in. A steady person can quiet panic without saying much. Collective grief deepens individual grief. Collective courage can make tolerable what alone would be unbearable. The brain is porous to social state because it evolved in environments where reading and sharing state was crucial for survival. This makes shame particularly powerful. Shame is not just the feeling of having done wrong. It is often the feeling of being made small before others, of becoming suddenly visible in the wrong way, of fearing that one's place in the group has become unstable. The body's response can be immediate and devastating. Eyes lower, speech fragments, heat rises, posture collapses, thought becomes rigid or confused. Shame is efficient because it enforces group norms from the inside. A person does not need a spear at their back if the nervous system has learned to punish deviation with intense internal pain. That punishment may be excessive, unjust, or manipulated by culture, but as a biological tool it is brutally effective. Lovera belongs to the survival system, though modern language often tries to elevate it beyond biology. Attachment is not reducible to chemistry, but chemistry is certainly involved. Bonding reduces risk, trust expands possibility. A child attached to a caregiver survives more readily. Adults bonded to reliable partners or groups often regulate stress more effectively and endure hardship with greater resilience. Affection, loyalty, and tenderness are not ornamental luxuries added after survival concerns are settled. They are among the ways survival is achieved in a social species. The same hidden system that detects threat is also constantly searching for cues of safety in faces, voices, and proximity. Warmth matters because it tells the body, at least for a moment, that it does not have to manage the world alone. At the same time, the social nervous system can be exploited. Authoritarian leaders, manipulative groups, and coercive relationships often succeed not only through force, but through their ability to hijack the same mechanisms that evolve for safety and belonging. They offer certainty, status, identity, and protection while increasing dependency and narrowing thought. The appeal is not mysterious. In times of fear, a system desperate for regulation may attach itself to rigid structure, confident authority, and tribal clarity even when those things become dangerous in their own right. No single explanation fully accounts for why some individuals are drawn more strongly than others into such dynamics. But the ancient biology of belonging is part of the story. And so the social brain lives in a permanent tension. Other people are medicine and threat, refuge and exposure, regulation and destabilization. The nervous system must remain open enough to receive safety and closed enough to survive betrayal. That balance is difficult under the best of conditions. It becomes much harder in worlds where social evaluation is constant. Comparison never ends. And strangers can enter the intimate field of the self at all hours through glowing screens and distant networks. Yet even before reaching that modern complication, the older truth remains: a human being is not built to experience safety alone for very long. The body expects company, recognition, and the possibility of being steadied by another mind. This is why exclusion wounds so deeply, why loneliness alters physiology, why status threats can feel like bodily emergencies, and why love can restore capacities that fear had nearly stripped away. The hidden survival system inside the brain is not just an alarm against predators and pain. It is also a social instrument, calibrated by belonging, rank, trust, and the terrifying possibility of being left outside the circle, beneath many of the grand words humans use for identity, dignity, betrayal, and devotion lies a simpler biological truth. For a social creature, safety has always had a face, and the brain is built to spend its life searching for it. The ancient survival system inside the brain is not malfunctioning because modern life feels overwhelming. In many ways, it is doing exactly what it was built to do, only now it is doing it in environments no ancestor would have recognized. The circuitry is old, the setting is new, and the mismatch between them may be one of the most important hidden facts of contemporary existence. A nervous system shaped by immediate danger now lives among abstractions, chronic signals, digital surveillance, economic uncertainty, artificial light, endless novelty, social comparison at scale, and a pace of change that often outstrips the body's ability to settle. The result is not simply stress, it is a condition in which ancient alarm systems are repeatedly activated by a world that rarely provides a clean moment of resolution. For most of human history, danger usually had edges. A storm came and passed, a predator appeared or did not, a conflict erupted and ended, a crossing was made or avoided, a fire burned, then cooled to ash. Even in harsh lives marked by deprivation and violence, there was often a certain clarity to threat. The body could mobilize around something concrete. It could scan a horizon, watch a face, listen for movement, run, hide, fight, or cling to the group. Once the immediate crisis ended, the nervous system had at least the possibility of returning to baseline, even if only briefly. Modern life often denies that return. The danger is diffuse, ambient, and informational. It lives in unanswered messages, unstable income, invisible audiences, bureaucratic judgment, future deadlines, algorithmic comparison, urban noise, and the subtle but constant feeling that one is behind, exposed, or not quite enough. The body does not necessarily understand this difference. It receives cues of urgency and responds according to older rules. A glowing screen at midnight delivers social uncertainty, reputational threat, bad news from distant places, financial numbers, arguments, crises, and demands for attention in the same narrow field of vision where earlier humans once scanned only firelight and nearby faces. The organism stiffens, sleep is delayed, cortisol remains elevated, breathing becomes shallow without obvious cause. The mind feels busy, but beneath the busyness is a simpler fact: the body has not been given permission to stand down. The ancient system has been fed a stream of unresolved cues, each one small enough to seem manageable, yet together sufficient to keep vigilance alive. Cities intensify this in obvious and subtle ways. Noise rarely fully stops. Light intrudes on darkness. Strangers move close without becoming known. Vehicles, sirens, crowds, confined spaces, surveillance cameras, and the constant demand for rapid navigation all require a particular kind of attention. For some people, cities become exhilarating precisely because they stimulate the nervous system so strongly. For others, the same conditions feel like a low-grade siege. The evidence remains incomplete on exactly how different urban environments alter stress physiology over time, but the general pattern is clear enough. Density, unpredictability, and overstimulation challenge a system that evolved in smaller groups and more legible spaces. The body must filter far more information than it was originally shaped to handle, and filtering itself is metabolically expensive. Then there is work, which in the modern world often recruits survival machinery through means that are both abstract and relentless. A missed target is not a predator, but it may threaten food, shelter, healthcare, status, or social standing. A tense meeting is not tribal expulsion, but the body can still respond as though hierarchy has turned dangerous. Performance reviews, public mistakes, constant availability, precarity, automation, metrics, and the fear of being replaceable all activate systems that were built to care deeply about rank, usefulness, and belonging. The body does not need to understand corporate structure in conceptual terms. It only needs to register that security feels conditional and that mistakes may have consequences beyond the immediate moment. This is one reason burnout can feel so total. It is not just tiredness. It is the exhaustion that follows prolonged mobilization without sufficient recovery, meaning, or clear resolution. A survival system built for temporary emergencies begins to live in a permanent administrative emergency instead. The person keeps going because the pressure's not dramatic enough to justify collapse, yet not small enough to ignore. Sleep becomes less restorative. Joy narrows. Irritability rises. Concentration frays. The body may become more reactive, more numb, or both in alternating waves. Ancient machinery is being asked to remain half-armed for problems that never end cleanly enough to let it rest. The digital environment adds another distortion. Human beings now receive social information at scales and speeds that the old nervous system was never meant to process. In earlier worlds, status and belonging were negotiated within visible groups of manageable size. One could, at least in principle, know who mattered, who was trusted, who was angry, who had turned away. Now a person can be praised, ignored, mocked, compared, invited, excluded, measured, and observed by audiences they will never meet. The brain treats social evaluation seriously because for most of human history it truly mattered. What changes in the digital age is not the seriousness of that evaluation, but its quantity and instability. There are too many eyes, too many judgments, and too few clear signals that the tribe is secure. This helps explain why social media can feel trivial and devastating at the same time. Intellectually, a person may know that a comment, a metric, or a delayed response should not matter much. Bodily, it may matter more than expected. The old social brain notices the possibility of exclusion, ridicule, status loss, or invisibility. It begins to scan. It checks again. It reads ambiguity as meaning. It starts living in a feedback loop of anticipation and interpretation. None of this requires vanity in the shallow sense. It requires only a nervous system built to care about where it stands in relation to others, now placed inside a network where those relations are constantly signaled but rarely resolved. Modern life also reduces many of the natural rhythms that once helped the body regulate itself. Darkness no longer reliably means rest. Hunger is no longer always linked to scarcity. Movement is no longer built into survival in the same way. Seasonal patterns are blurred by controlled indoor climates and constant artificial environments. Meals, sleep, work, and social contact drift away from older rhythms and become fragmented, inconsistent, and often disconnected from bodily need. The survival system, which evolved in close contact with physical cycles, must now infer safety inside a world where many cues are synthetic, delayed, or contradictory. It can do this to some extent, but the cost may be greater than people realize. There is a quieter problem as well. Many modern threats are not actionable in the way ancient threats were. A person can run from a snake. It is harder to run from climate anxiety, political instability, debt, family estrangement, reputational uncertainty, or the diffuse dread that one's life is being shaped by systems too large to understand. The body mobilizes anyway. It prepares for action because that is what it knows how to do. But the action often has nowhere meaningful to go. The result can be a trapped form of activation, agitation without resolution, vigilance without object, anger without target, fear without escape. This is one of the characteristic torments of modern nervous systems. The organism is ready for a problem that cannot be solved with movement alone. At the same time, many traditional sources of regulation have weakened or become inconsistent. Extended families are more fragmented. Neighborhoods can be socially thin. Ritual has declined in many places. Religious belonging may be lost without a clear replacement. Work is unstable, housing expensive, movement frequent, and community increasingly optional in theory, but difficult to build in practice. The human nervous system did not evolve to regulate itself in isolated units. Moving through bureaucratic systems while privately absorbing endless streams of alarm. Yet this has become ordinary for many people. No single explanation fully accounts for rising unease across modern societies, but the loss of shared regulation and stable belonging is almost certainly part of the story. Even leisure has become complicated. Rest itself can feel unsafe to a survival system trained by constant demands. A free evening may not be experienced as relief, but as a vacuum into which worry rushes. Silence, once a sign of temporary safety, may become suspicious. Stillness may reveal bodily tension that busyness had temporarily concealed. This is one of the modern paradoxes. People often long for relief and then struggle to inhabit it when it arrives. The body has been conditioned to expect interruption, judgment, or fresh input. Calm then feels unfamiliar, and unfamiliarity is not always interpreted as safe. Scholars still debate how much of this mismatch should be attributed to technology itself, to economic structures, to cultural expectations, or to broader changes in social life. The evidence remains incomplete, and easy nostalgia can distort the picture. Earlier eras are not models of nervous system peace. They contain violence, deprivation, and ceaseless hardship of their own. but the comparison still reveals something important. Modern humans are not simply stressed because they are weak or because they think too much. They are often living inside systems that repeatedly trigger ancient defenses while offering fewer of the cues those defenses evolved alongside embodied community, visible resolution, physical rhythms, and clear boundaries between danger and recovery. This does not mean the old brain is obsolete. Far from it. Its caution still protects. Its vigilance still notices real problems. Its sensitivity to social rupture still helps hold groups together. Its ability to mobilize under threat remains one of the reasons humans survive disaster at all. The problem is not that the circuitry is outdated. The problem is that it is being asked to respond continuously to environments built with very different assumptions about attention, time, and belonging. The body is not failing to keep up with modernity. It is paying the physiological price of trying. And so the modern world becomes a peculiar kind of habitat, safer in many objective ways than ancient life, yet capable of making many people feel persistently less safe in their own bodies. There are fewer predators in the grass, but more invisible systems of evaluation. Fewer immediate physical threats for many, but more chronic ambiguity, more convenience, more control over environment, more access to information, yet also more exposure, more comparison, and less reliable off-switches for the old alarm circuits. The hidden survival system continues its work inside all this, scanning the room, the inbox, the balance sheet, the doorway, the news feed, the silence after a message, the expression on a face lit by a screen. It is still doing what it has always done. It is asking whether the organism can safely release its guard. The trouble is that modern life keeps answering with maybe later. When the survival system works well, it is almost invisible. It rises quickly when danger appears, helps the organism endure, and then eases its grip when the world becomes safe enough again. The problem begins when that cycle no longer completes. Alarm remains active after the threat has passed, or it activates too easily, or it spreads into too many corners of life, until what was once protective starts to feel like captivity. This is the point at which survival can seem to turn against the person it was built to preserve. Yet even here, it is worth being careful. The system has not become malicious. It has become persistent, miscalibrated, or trapped in a pattern that made sense once and now no longer matches the world. This is the hidden cruelty of anxiety. It is not simply worry in the ordinary sense. It is a body living too close to readiness, a mind repeatedly pulled toward possible threat, a nervous system that no longer trusts the absence of obvious danger as sufficient evidence of safety. The person may know they're not in immediate peril and still feel the chest tighten, the thoughts accelerate, the stomach clench, the sleep fragment, the attention narrow around small uncertainties that become impossibly large. The reaction often looks exaggerated because the present trigger is small, but the trigger is not the whole story. It is only the doorway through which older protective logic rushes back into action. Panic is one of the purest examples of this logic running at intolerable intensity. In panic, the body mounts an emergency response so forceful that the response itself becomes terrifying. Heart rate climbs, breathing shifts, dizziness, numbness, heat, trembling, derealization, chest pain, and a sense of imminent catastrophe may appear in rapid sequence. The person often believes they are dying, losing control, or about to go mad, because the survival system has produced a bodily state that in ordinary life is associated with severe danger. From the inside, the fear is not irrational in the shallow sense. The body is generating evidence of emergency, The fact that the evidence originates inside the system rather than outside it does not make it feel any less real. This is part of the tragic circularity of survival gone awry. The brain detects threat, recruits the body, then interprets the body's recruited state as further evidence that the threat must indeed be serious. A racing heart becomes frightening. The fear of that sensation increases the racing heart. Shortness of breath becomes alarming. The alarm changes breathing again. A loop forms, and once it tightens, abstract reassurance is often too weak to interrupt it quickly. The person is not merely thinking catastrophic thoughts. They're inhabiting a physiology that makes catastrophe feel already underway. Chronic stress operates through a slower but equally corrosive path. Here the system may never explode dramatically. Instead, it remains partially activated for too long. Cortisol patterns shift. Sleep becomes shallower or less restorative. Digestion changes. Irritability rises. Immunity may alter. Concentration weakens. Joy becomes harder to access. The body starts living as if something important is unresolved, even if the person cannot point to one single event explaining why. This state can become so familiar that it begins to feel like personality rather than condition. A person says they are just high-strung, always on edge, bad at relaxing, naturally restless, never good at sleeping, as though these are neutral traits rather than possible signs of a system that has forgotten how to stand down. Burnout is often the social face of this prolonged activation. It appears in worlds that reward endurance while quietly stripping away recovery. The person keeps meeting demands, keeps pushing, keeps responding, keeps proving that they can function, until eventually the machinery begins to fail in uneven ways. Motivation collapses, cynicism grows, the smallest tasks feel heavy, decision-making becomes harder, emotional range narrows. Sometimes there is numbness rather than anguish, which can be misread as laziness or indifference. But what may actually be happening is that a survival system kept in sustained mobilization has begun shifting toward protective shutdown because full activation is no longer metabolically possible. Trauma-related disorders make this even more visible. In such conditions, the nervous system may continue reacting as though a previous threat has not truly ended. Reminders that resemble the original danger can provoke intense bodily and emotional responses. Sleep may be invaded by nightmares. Attention may become hyper-focused on possible repetition. Trust may erode. Startle responses may intensify. At the same time, parts of the person may go numb, detached, or emotionally flattened. Hyper-arousal and shutdown can coexist in bewildering sequence, because the system is trying both to prepare and to protect against overload. The evidence remains incomplete on exactly why some individuals develop lasting trauma-related patterns after certain events while others recover more fully, though prior history, social support, developmental context, genetics, and the nature of the threat all appear to matter. No single explanation fully accounts for the outcome, and that uncertainty remains one of the hardest facts in the field. The same is true of anxiety disorders more broadly. Scholars still debate where to place the boundary between normal vigilance and clinical disorder, because the mechanisms overlap so deeply. Anxiety is not an alien process descending from nowhere. It is survival machinery working along familiar lines, only with thresholds that have become too low, too generalized, or too difficult to reset. A person who fears leaving the house, speaking publicly, being judged, being contaminated, making a mistake, or feeling bodily sensations associated with danger is often not living in a separate reality, so much as living under a survival system that has expanded its definition of threat. The old protective architecture is still recognizable. It has simply become too costly in the world the person must now inhabit. Depression, too, may intersect with survival in ways that are often underappreciated. It is not reducible to a survival response, and any simple explanation here would be misleading. Yet some depressive states bear the marks of prolonged defeat, depletion, or shutdown. When action has felt impossible for too long, when stress has remained unresolved, when the body has spent too long braced against what it cannot change, energy may collapse, motivation disappears, the future shortens. Pleasure becomes inaccessible. In some cases, this resembles a nervous system moving away from impossible mobilization into a darker form of conservation. The interpretation remains debated, and depression is clearly more complex than a single survival mechanism. Still, what survives in the evidence suggests that hopelessness can sometimes emerge where the system no longer believes effective action will change the conditions of threat. There is another irony in all this. The very people praised for functioning well under pressure may be the ones most at risk of becoming trapped by these patterns. A person who learned early to ignore exhaustion, suppress fear, stay useful, and remain productive under strain can appear highly capable for a very long time. They may excel in demanding environments because their survival system knows how to keep going. But success under chronic pressure is not the same as safety. It can conceal immense physiological cost. The body keeps the account, even when the culture applauds the performance. This is why survival turned inward can be so difficult to recognize. The symptoms are often interpreted morally before they are understood biologically. Panic becomes weakness. Chronic anxiety becomes overthinking. Burnout becomes poor attitude. Shutdown becomes laziness. Hypervigilance becomes being dramatic. Emotional numbing becomes coldness. Compulsive control becomes perfectionism in the flattering sense. Yet beneath these labels there may be a nervous system making increasingly desperate attempts to maintain protection in a world that keeps asking too much of it, or resembles dangers it never fully resolved. One of the lesser-known features of these conditions is how much they alter perception itself. A person in chronic anxiety does not simply have more fearful thoughts, layered onto an otherwise normal experience of reality. The world actually appears different. Threat cues stand out more sharply. Ambiguity leans negative. Neutral faces may seem less safe. Bodily sensations seem more significant. Time can feel thinner, narrower, more urgent. Likewise, a person in shutdown may not simply feel sad while perceiving the same world everyone else sees. The world may appear flattened, distant, stripped of colour and meaning, as though motivational systems themselves have gone dim. The survival system does not only produce feelings, it helps determine what kind of world the person seems to be living in. That is why these states are so difficult to argue away. Reason addresses beliefs, but survival states are not only beliefs, they are embodied modes of existence. They change pulse, chemistry, attention, memory, interpretation, and expectation all at once. Telling someone in such a state to calm down, cheer up, think positively, or just stop worrying is often less than useless. It mistakes a whole body pattern for a bad idea. In reality, the person may be caught in a mode of protection that their conscious mind does not know how to exit on command. And yet the fact that these conditions are miscalibrated forms of survival is not only dark, it also contains a clue. If the system is not evil but protective, then its symptoms, however painful, may be understood less as personal defects and more as costly attempts at safety. That shift matters. It does not cure anything by itself, but it changes the moral atmosphere around suffering. A panic attack becomes less a humiliation than an emergency response misfiring at full volume. Chronic vigilance becomes less a character flaw than a system refusing to trust uncertainty. Numbness becomes less a failure to care than a protective distance from overwhelm. This does not romanticize suffering. There is nothing noble about being trapped by alarms that should have ended long ago. The damage can be enormous. Relationships strain, work collapses, sleep erodes, health suffers, hope narrows. The survival system can become a prison built from its own former intelligence. But seeing that prison clearly matters, because it reveals the continuity between ordinary protective life and clinical distress. The difference is often not kind versus broken, but flexible versus stuck, temporary versus prolonged, calibrated versus overgeneralized. So when survival turns against us, it is not truly turning against us in intention. It is repeating old logic too faithfully, applying ancient probabilities to modern conditions, and protecting long after protection should have softened. It is a smoke alarm that cannot forget the fire, a guard that no longer believes dawn means safety, a body that has learned caution so deeply it begins to mistake vigilance for existence itself. And in that tragic persistence lies one of the central mysteries of the brain. The very machinery that preserves life can, under certain conditions, make life feel unbearably hard to live. Some of the clearest evidence for the hidden survival system comes not from ordinary life, but from the moments when parts of that system are damaged, disconnected, overstimulated, or thrown into strange imbalance. In those moments, the brain becomes easier to read precisely because it stops behaving normally. Functions that usually cooperate begin to separate. Fear appears without cause, or fails to appear when it should. Pain becomes too loud, too faint, or detached from injury. A person recognizes a face but not the emotion in it. Another understands a threat intellectually but cannot feel its urgency in the body. Another feels the body's alarm so intensely that the world seems organized entirely around danger. These distortions are not only tragedies or curiosities, they are clues. They reveal the machinery by showing what happens when one gear slips against another. Brain injury has been teaching this lesson for a very long time. When a stroke, tumor, seizure disorder, infection, degenerative disease, or traumatic impact changes specific networks. The person who emerges afterward may carry a nervous system with altered thresholds of fear, altered stress responses, altered impulse control, or altered emotional interpretation. Suddenly, the hidden architecture becomes visible in the gaps. A person once cautious becomes reckless. Another becomes overwhelmed by minor stimuli. Another loses the ability to regulate panic. Another seems strangely indifferent to genuine danger. The survival system, so often mistaken for a vague emotional background, reveals itself as a concrete biological arrangement whose disruption changes how the world itself is experienced. The amygdala offers one of the most famous examples, though once again the truth is subtler than the textbook version. Damage to the amygdala can reduce certain kinds of fear learning and threat recognition, especially in relation to faces and emotionally salient cues. There are rare cases in which individuals with severe amygdala damage show an astonishing lack of fear in situations that would terrify most people. This does not mean they become universally invulnerable to all forms of danger or lose every emotional response. The evidence remains more complicated than popular summaries suggest, but the pattern matters. It shows that fear is not merely a philosophical conclusion one arrives at by reasoning. It depends on specific neural systems that help assign urgency to the world. What makes this especially striking is that without those systems, the person may still understand danger abstractly. They may know, in words, that something is risky, yet the bodily conviction is weakened or absent. The gap between knowing and feeling becomes visible. This is the same gap ordinary people glimpse in milder form when they know they are safe but do not feel safe. In brain damage, the reverse may appear: the person knows a thing is dangerous but fails to feel appropriate alarm. The split reveals that cognition and survival state, though deeply intertwined, are not identical. One can exist without fully carrying the other. The opposite pattern can emerge when threat systems overfire. Certain seizure disorders, for instance, can produce sudden surges of terror without an external cause that makes ordinary sense. The person may feel overwhelming dread, unreality, impending doom, or bodily catastrophe because abnormal electrical activity has recruited networks involved in salience, bodily signaling, or emotional processing. In such moments, the old question of whether fear is rational becomes almost irrelevant. The body and brain have already generated a survival state first. Meaning is added afterward, if at all. These cases show with unusual clarity that panic does not always begin with a thought. Sometimes it begins with circuitry. The insula provides another revealing clue. This region is deeply involved in interoception, the sensing of the internal state of the body. It helps track heartbeat, breath, gut sensation, temperature, pain, and the broader feeling of what is happening inside the organism. When insular processing changes, people may become unusually sensitive to bodily signals or strangely disconnected from them. This matters enormously for survival, because the body is one of the main sources of evidence the brain uses to estimate threat. If internal signals are amplified, ambiguous sensations may become frightening. If they are dulled, danger may go underappreciated. The balance is delicate. Too much bodily alarm can trap a person in hypervigilance. Too little can impair protective caution. Pain disorders reveal this even more starkly. Some neurological conditions produce pain without obvious tissue damage. Others reduce pain in ways that expose the person to serious injury because harm no longer feels urgent enough to avoid. Congenital insensitivity to pain, though rare, is among the most haunting examples. At first glance it may sound like a strange advantage, but in reality it is profoundly dangerous. Without pain, the organism loses one of its most effective guides to protection. Cuts worsen, fractures go unnoticed, burns do not command withdrawal. The body becomes vulnerable not because it is weak, but because one of its core warning systems is missing. This teaches a severe lesson. Pain is not a design flaw. It is costly because it must be powerful enough to matter. Phantom limb pain offers the opposite kind of clue. Here the body part may be gone, yet the pain remains. A hand no longer exists, and still it aches, burns, twists, or clenches in perception. This is one of the clearest demonstrations that pain is not simply a direct readout of tissue. It is constructed by the brain from maps, expectations, sensory memories, and protective logic. The system continues producing pain because the representation remains active. Even in the absence of the limb itself, such cases are deeply distressing, but they reveal the survival brain's operational style with unusual precision. It protects not only present tissue, it protects its model of the body. Disorders of emotional expression and recognition also illuminate the social side of survival. Some people with particular forms of frontal or temporal damage become less able to read fear, disgust, or threat in faces. Others lose social inhibition and behave as though consequences no longer carry the same force. Still others become intensely reactive to slight provocation because the systems that once helped regulate impulse and assign context are weakened. These changes show that survival does not depend only on obvious fear centers. It depends on broader networks linking perception, memory, bodily state, social judgment, and control. A face must be recognized as fearful. A rising impulse must be checked or redirected. A bodily sensation must be interpreted in context rather than treated as catastrophic by default. When any of these links are damaged, the hidden architecture becomes easier to map. The frontal regions are especially important here. They do not eliminate the old survival system, but they help modulate it, contextualize it, and sometimes restrain it. Damage to these areas can lead to poor risk assessment, impulsivity, emotional volatility, or the failure to learn from punishment in ordinary ways. A person may become less capable of integrating future consequences into present choice. Again, this does not mean the frontal lobes are a simple rational ruler sitting above irrational lower circuits. That story is too neat. The evidence suggests something more interactive. Regulation emerges through communication between systems. When that communication breaks down, alarm may dominate, or else danger may fail to register with sufficient seriousness. Either way, behavior changes. One of the more unsettling clues comes from people with disorders that alter bodily self-awareness or ownership. In some rare syndromes, individuals may deny that a limb belongs to them, fail to recognize paralysis, or misattribute bodily states in bizarre ways. These are extreme disruptions, but they point toward a central truth. The survival system depends on a coherent sense of the body as something worth monitoring and protecting. If the brain's model of the body becomes unstable, many other functions begin to fracture. Protection relies on representation. The organism must know, in some deep integrated sense, what it is defending. Laboratory experiments, though less dramatic than injury, also reveal important patterns. Researchers can measure startle responses, threat conditioning, stress hormone release, autonomic shifts, and changes in attention under controlled conditions. They can observe how quickly people learn to fear certain cues, how hard those learned associations are to extinguish, and how prior stress alters later sensitivity. They can track the way sleep loss amplifies threat perception, how inflammation affects mood and vigilance, or how early adversity changes physiological response patterns later in life. The evidence remains incomplete in many details, and laboratory life is only a narrow slice of real human experience. But the convergence is powerful. Across methods, the same broad architecture keeps appearing: threat detection, bodily mobilization, emotional memory, social evaluation, and contextual regulation all interact to create what a person experiences as danger or safety. There are also clues from rare syndromes involving profound anxiety or its absence. Some people experience relentless health anxiety, panic sensitivity, or obsessive fear despite repeated reassurance. Others with certain neurological conditions may behave with baffling fearlessness, entering risky situations without the bodily hesitation most people take for granted. Neither extreme is enviable. Together they make visible the delicate calibration required for ordinary survival. Fear must be strong enough to protect and flexible enough to release. It must generalize somewhat, but not too much. It must take memory seriously, but not become imprisoned by it. Seeing how these balances fail helps explain how remarkable ordinary regulation actually is when it works. Scholars still debate exactly how best to divide the brain into systems when talking about emotion and survival. The old models that assign one structure to one feeling are too crude. The newer network-based models are more accurate, but also more difficult to simplify. No single explanation fully accounts for why one person becomes hypervigilant after injury, while another becomes apathetic, or why similar lesions can produce different outcomes depending on development, context, and prior history. The brain is not modular in the tidy mechanical sense people often wish for, but that very messiness teaches something important. Survival is not produced by one isolated center. It is assembled through relations body to brain, memory to perception, social context to physiology, regulation to impulse. What all these disorders and disruptions reveal, in the end, is not only fragility but sophistication. The hidden survival system is not a primitive leftover crudely bolted beneath higher thought. It is an intricate living coordination of prediction, sensation, memory, social meaning, and bodily control. Damage one part, and the whole pattern changes. Overactivate one part, and life can become unbearable. Silence another, and the organism may lose protections it never knew it depended on. The old machinery is not elegant in the aesthetic sense, but it is astonishingly integrated. And there is a final irony here. People often become aware of the survival brain most clearly when something has gone wrong. A seizure, a brain injury, a panic disorder, a trauma syndrome, a pain condition, a degenerative disease. Yet these breakdowns do more than expose vulnerability. They also confirm that the strange invisible forces shaping ordinary life are real, physical, and measurable. The chest that tightens before bad news, the body that freezes in conflict, the panic that outruns thought, the social pain that feels bodily, the calm that arrives through another person's presence, the memory that lives in sensation long after language fails. These are not poetic inventions. They are signs of a deeply embodied system that can be studied precisely because, under certain conditions, it cracks open and reveals its workings. In that sense, damage and disorder are cruel teachers. They show what the brain is doing by showing what happens when it cannot do it properly, and from those failures emerges a clearer view of the hidden machinery itself, a survival system that is ancient, distributed, fallible, and indispensable, shaping human life not from the margins but from the center of what it means to feel, fear, remember, and remain alive. If the hidden survival system can be wounded, overtrained, exhausted, or trapped, the next question becomes unavoidable. Can it be changed deliberately? Can something so old, so fast, and so deeply embodied be taught a different lesson? The honest answer is both less dramatic and more hopeful than people often want. The system is not infinitely malleable. It cannot be reasoned out of existence, and it does not dissolve simply because a person finally understands why they react as they do. But neither is it fixed in stone. The survival brain learns. It always has. It is built from learning, and that means, under the right conditions, it can sometimes learn again. This is one of the most important facts about human life, though it is often hidden behind simplistic language about healing, self-improvement, or mental toughness. Change in the survival system rarely looks like a sudden conversion. It looks more like repetition under altered conditions. A body that once expected danger begins, slowly and unevenly, to encounter enough experiences of safety, predictability, agency, and successful recovery that its predictions start to shift. The change may feel subtle at first. A pause before panic, a conflict survived without collapse, a night of deeper sleep, a moment when the chest loosens more quickly than before. These are small signs, but the survival system is built from such increments. It does not ask whether a new life story sounds beautiful. It asks whether the evidence has become strong enough to justify a different response. Therapy, in its best forms, often works through exactly this mechanism. Popular imagination sometimes treats therapy as a purely verbal exercise, a place where one gains insight and therefore becomes free. Insight matters, but it is usually not enough by itself. Many people understand their histories with painful precision, while their bodies continue reacting as though the old dangers remain current. The deeper change comes when understanding is paired with repeated experiences that alter prediction. A person names fear and is not abandoned. They remember something overwhelming and do not disintegrate. They notice bodily arousal and remain present long enough for it to pass. They experiment with new behavior and survive the shame or uncertainty that once seemed unbearable. The system begins, slowly, to register that certain old equations are no longer perfectly true. Different therapeutic approaches try to reach this through different routes. Some focus on thought, helping a person recognize distorted predictions and challenge catastrophic interpretations. This can be powerful, especially when the survival system has grown overly broad in what it labels dangerous. If a person repeatedly learns that feared outcomes do not occur, or that they are survivable when they do, the system may reduce its alarm over time. But cognition alone rarely reaches every layer. The body often needs its own evidence. This is why therapies involving exposure, bodily awareness, movement, breath, relational safety, or carefully titrated contact with difficult memory can matter so much. They help convert abstract reassurance into lived proof. Exposure, though often misunderstood, reflects one of the simplest and most severe principles of survival learning. If the system has linked a cue to danger, then avoiding that cue forever may preserve the alarm because the prediction is never updated. Under the right conditions, careful repeated exposure can teach something new. The elevator does not kill, the crowd does not destroy. The bodily sensation rises and then falls. The feared conversation is survivable. The dog passes without attack. The memory can be touched in small doses without complete collapse. This is not about forcing courage in a theatrical sense. It is about giving the nervous system new data. Still, the process is delicate. Too much exposure, too fast, can reinforce terror rather than reduce it. Scholars still debate why some exposure-based methods work strikingly well for some people and poorly for others, but timing, context, trust, and perceived control all seem to matter. Breathing appears almost embarrassingly simple compared with the grandeur of the brain, yet it matters because it is one of the few bodily processes that sits at the border between automatic and voluntary control. Under threat, breathing changes quickly. It becomes shallow, rapid, held, erratic, or tight. These changes feed the survival state, sending fresh evidence back to the brain that something is wrong, slowing the breath, lengthening the exhale, and restoring rhythm can sometimes interrupt this loop, not because breathing is magic, but because the body treats respiratory pattern as meaningful information. A slower breath is not always enough to calm severe alarm, but it can help change the message moving upward from the body. The ancient system listens. Movement can do something similar. The human body evolved to resolve many stress states through action. When activation builds and has nowhere to go, walking, shaking, stretching, lifting, running, or rhythmic physical effort can help complete patterns that would otherwise remain stuck. This is one reason exercise can alter mood and reduce anxiety for many people, though not universally and not always immediately. The benefits are not only chemical, though chemistry matters. Movement reminds the organism that mobilization can have an outlet. It can reduce helplessness, restore a sense of agency, and help discharge states of readiness that otherwise linger in the muscles and breath. Sleep, too, is foundational. A sleep-deprived brain becomes more threat-sensitive, more emotionally reactive, and less capable of nuanced regulation. The relationship runs both ways, since an activated survival system makes sleep harder to achieve, but when sleep improves, many other processes become more flexible. Memory is sorted differently, hormonal patterns stabilize, ambiguity becomes easier to tolerate, fear responses can soften. It is a humbling fact that some of what people experience as moral failure or psychological collapse is intensified simply because the organism has not been allowed to enter the state from which repair is possible. The old survival system does not do its finest work on exhaustion. Social safety may be even more important than private effort, though modern culture often prefers stories of individual mastery. A trusted relationship can recalibrate what the body expects from closeness, conflict, and vulnerability. Repeated experiences of being understood, not attacked, in moments of fear or shame can reshape the conditions under which alarm rises. This is one reason isolated self-help often reaches a limit. The survival system is social by design. If danger was learned in relationship, some of the most powerful counter-evidence may also have to arrive through relationship. A steady therapist, partner, friend, mentor, or community can help provide this, not by rescuing the person from every discomfort, but by offering enough consistency that the body slowly begins to treat connection itself as less dangerous. Ritual has a place here too, though it is rarely framed in neuroscientific language. Repeated patterned behavior, prayer, chanting, communal singing, ceremony, breath practices, meditative movement, morning customs, daily routines can help signal predictability and reduce uncertainty. The evidence is uneven, and scholars still debate which elements matter most: rhythm, social synchrony, expectancy, meaning, bodily entrainment, belief. No single explanation fully accounts for the effects. But across cultures, human beings have long used ritual to regulate fear, grief, transition, and social belonging. Ancient bodies often respond to pattern before they respond to theory. Medication, when helpful, does not replace this deeper learning but can sometimes make it possible. If panic, depression, hyperarousal, or obsessive fear are strong enough, the system may be too locked to absorb new experience effectively. Medications may reduce the volume of the alarm, stabilize mood, improve sleep, or soften compulsive loops enough that the person can begin doing the work of retraining. They are not magical solutions, and they do not work the same way for everyone. Some help greatly, others help little or come with costs that complicate the picture. The biology remains complex, and the evidence is still evolving. But the larger point stands: changing the survival system sometimes requires support at more than one level at once. There is also the role of interpretation. The body is influenced not only by what happens, but by what the person believes their bodily state means. A racing heart can mean danger, humiliation, excitement, or effort depending on context. Pain can mean damage, healing, illness, or temporary strain. If interpretation shifts, the same sensations may become less catastrophic. This does not mean people can simply think their way out of distress. It means meaning participates in regulation. A person who learns that certain bodily sensations are survivable may stop feeding them into the old emergency loop. That shift alone can reduce secondary fear, the fear of fear itself, which is often one of the most imprisoning elements in chronic anxiety. Yet retraining has limits, and pretending otherwise becomes cruel. Some nervous systems carry burdens so deep, developmental, or biologically reinforced that change is partial, slow, and uneven. Some people can reduce symptoms dramatically. Others may only gain a little more room around them. Some can build a life that feels spacious. Others may spend years learning how to live gently with persistent alarm rather than erasing it. This is not failure, it is realism. The survival brain is ancient because it is powerful. It does not surrender all its habits because a culture of optimization wants quick transformation. Still, even limited change matters. A panic attack shortened by 5 minutes is real change. A conflict endured without dissociation is real change. A body that sleeps slightly deeper, startles slightly less, trusts slightly sooner, or recovers slightly faster is not performing a trivial miracle. It is revising ancient probabilities, and that revision has consequences far beyond private comfort. It alters relationships, work, creativity, intimacy, and the very sense of what the future can hold. Perhaps the deepest lesson is that the survival system often changes not when it's bullied into silence, but when it's met with enough consistency that it no longer needs to shout so loudly. The body rarely learns safety from contempt. It learns from pattern, from repetition, from experience surviving what once seemed unsurvivable, from discovering, again and again, that activation can rise and fall, that uncertainty can be endured, that pain is not always catastrophe, that closeness is not always danger, that rest does not always invite attack. These are simple lessons in wording, but immense lessons in physiology. So yes, the hidden system can sometimes be retrained. Though not in the clean linear way modern language prefers, it is less like rewriting software and more like teaching an old animal to trust a changed landscape. The old instincts remain, the scars remain. The watchfulness may never entirely disappear, but the organism can, in many cases, learn a different rhythm. It can lower the guard a little sooner. It can widen the space between cue and alarm. It can begin to believe that safety is not only a brief accident, but a state that can be inhabited, however imperfectly, for longer stretches of time, and for a brain built first to survive, that may be one of the most profound transformations possible. By the time the hidden survival system has been traced through fear, pain, memory, childhood, social life, disorder, and possible repair, it begins to look less like a private mechanism and more like a quiet force running beneath the whole human story. It does not remain confined to moments of panic or personal distress. It scales upward. It helps shape families, loyalties, rituals, conflicts, migrations, prejudices, alliances, governments, myths, and wars. The old brain that scans a room for danger is also present, multiplied across millions of bodies, inside tribes, crowds, nations, and civilizations. And once that becomes visible, history itself starts to look slightly different. It begins to resemble not only a sequence of ideas and events, but a vast record of nervous systems trying to secure safety in an unstable world. This does not reduce human history to biology in any crude sense. Belief, culture, technology, geography, and power all matter profoundly. But beneath these visible structures lies a more ancient problem that never disappears. Who belongs? Who threatens? What protects? What must be defended? What loss cannot be tolerated? The hidden survival system helps assign emotional force to these questions. It gives urgency to boundary, territory, rank, identity, inheritance, and vengeance. A tribe that feels cornered behaves differently from one that feels secure. A population living under prolonged instability becomes easier to mobilize through fear. A community that experiences humiliation may carry the wound across generations. The scale changes, but the logic remains hauntingly familiar. Much of collective behavior becomes easier to understand through this lens, though not more flattering. Human beings do not merely reason themselves into group loyalties. They feel their way into them. The group becomes safety. Its symbols become bodily meaningful. Its enemies become threatening not only as abstract opponents, but as sources of danger to belonging, order, and survival itself. Once identity fuses with protection, compromise becomes harder, nuance weakens, threat perception sharpens, outgroups are monitored, exaggerated, or dehumanized because the survival brain prefers simplified maps in times of fear. This is one of the darkest continuities between ancient life and modern politics. The machinery that once helped small groups survive can, at larger scales, help justify suspicion, cruelty, and violence. Religion, too, cannot be fully understood without the survival brain somewhere in the background. This does not mean religious life is merely fear dressed in symbols. That would be too shallow. But it does mean that existential uncertainty, death awareness, moral order, ritual predictability, shared belonging, and the longing for protection all resonate deeply with systems built to care about danger and safety. Ritual can soothe. Collective worship can regulate. Cosmologies can reduce uncertainty. Stories about punishment, refuge, contamination, salvation, and chosen community can hook directly into the emotional architecture of survival. What looks purely spiritual from one angle often also functions as a nervous system technology, helping bodies endure a world too large and uncertain to bear alone. The same is true of nationalism, ideology, and collective myth. A flag is cloth, but not only cloth. A border is a line, but not only a line. A story about who belongs and who threatens can acquire extraordinary power because it organizes fear and belonging at once. People will fight, sacrifice, submit, or kill for abstractions when those abstractions have become fused with bodily meanings of safety, dignity, and continuity. The old survival system does not care whether the banner above it is religious, political, ethnic, or cultural. It cares whether the banner seems to promise protection and coherent identity against danger. That promise can be used nobly or monstrously. Biology does not decide which. Prejudice often feeds on the same mechanisms. The brain is built to categorize quickly, infer intent from incomplete cues, and treat unfamiliarity cautiously when stakes seem high. In small ancestral settings, this may sometimes have offered protection. In complex modern societies, the same tendencies can harden into racial bias, xenophobia, sectarian hatred, and moral panic. Scholars still debate exactly how much prejudice should be explained through evolved threat detection versus learned culture, institutions, and historical power structures. The answer is clearly not simple. No single explanation fully accounts for hatred, but the survival system is part of the background condition. It makes fear sticky, difference salient, and simplified narratives emotionally persuasive, especially under stress. Migration reveals another side of the story. Human beings have always moved in response to danger, scarcity, opportunity, and hope. Behind great shifts of population lie countless survival calculations: drought, invasion, failing harvest, collapsing order, rising seas, political terror, economic impossibility, the desire to place children somewhere safer than the place now available. Migrations are often told through maps and dates, but beneath them is the old logic of nervous systems responding to conditions they no longer trust. To leave home is painful because attachment matters. To stay can be worse. And so human history is filled with bodies carrying alarm across landscapes in search of a place where the guard may finally soften. War may be the most brutal large-scale expression of the survival brain, because it recruits ancient defenses while attaching them to organized power, technology, and narrative. Fear sharpens group cohesion. Threat justifies hierarchy. Pain is turned into memory. Memory into vengeance. Vengeance into policy. The body's readiness for danger becomes a national resource. Young people are trained to override some ancient inhibitions while intensifying others. The enemy is made less human so that the social brain no longer recognizes them as a source of mutual regulation or kin-like concern. It is a horrifying transformation, but an intelligible one. The same hidden machinery that protects children and bonds lovers can, under other arrangements, be harnessed to sustain destruction on a massive scale. And yet the survival system is not responsible only for violence and fear. It also underlies many of the best features of human life. Cooperation is survival. Rescue is survival. Loyalty, generosity, caregiving, and courage all emerge partly because human beings are built to recognize that other lives matter to their own continuity. A parent entering danger for a child, a stranger pulling another from floodwater, a community feeding its vulnerable members, friends sitting beside the sick through the night. Even the quiet human impulse to comfort someone crying in public, these are not departures from biology. They are biology expressed through social interdependence. The same deep architecture that makes abandonment so painful also makes care so powerful. Civilization itself may be read, in part, as an attempt to solve survival at scale. Laws reduce uncertainty. Granaries reduce famine risk. Walls promise security. Money stores future labor against present instability. Medicine protects weak bodies. Schools transmit usable patterns. Archives preserve memory. Roads, treaties, courts, kinship systems, sanitation, and shared norms all reduce the burden on the individual nervous system by making the world more predictable. Of course, civilizations also produce new dangers, new hierarchies, new exclusions, and new forms of large-scale fear. Every structure that protects some may endanger others. Still, the broader impulse remains visible. Human beings build systems, in part, because the lone body is too vulnerable to survive uncertainty by itself. This may be why trust is one of the most valuable and fragile substances in any society. Trust lowers the cost of vigilance. It allows people to sleep, trade, speak, plan, love, and imagine futures beyond immediate defense. When trust erodes, the survival system rises in compensation. People arm themselves, withdraw, radicalize, cling more tightly to tribe, and become more susceptible to narratives that promise certainty. Social breakdown is not only political, it is physiological. It forces millions of nervous systems back towards smaller, harsher calculations. The world feels less inhabitable because, at a deep level, it is. What survives across all of this is an unsettling possibility. Human history may be, to a significant degree, the story of brains trying to feel safe. Not safe only in the material sense, though that matters. safe in the social sense, the moral sense, the existential sense, safe from hunger, exile, chaos, humiliation, loneliness, predation, death, and the unbearable unpredictability of other people. Great monuments may celebrate glory, but beneath them often lie fear, scarcity, protection, devotion, and the desire to push back against fragility. Empires expand partly because they are ambitious, but also because they are afraid. Borders harden partly because of identity, but also because of threat. Love deepens partly because of romance, but also because no human body is meant to meet the dark alone. There is no cynical reduction here, or none that does justice to the fullness of the story. To say that the survival system runs beneath history is not to say that art, ethics, philosophy, and wonder are illusions. It is to say that they arise in creatures whose first task was never transcendence. It was continuation. The miracle is not that human beings remain bound to ancient survival logic. The miracle is that from within that logic they have made music, tenderness, sacrifice, law, memory, curiosity, and entire worlds of meaning. The hidden system is old, severe, and often frightened, yet around it, and partly because of it, human beings have built forms of life that sometimes exceed mere survival and begin to resemble wisdom. Still, the old machinery remains. It lives inside the citizen, the lover, the refugee, the ruler, the child, the crowd, the believer, the skeptic, the exhausted worker, the grieving parent, the lonely elder, the online mob, the soldier, the healer. It scans for danger in every age using tools shaped in earlier ones. It longs for safety and often mistakes certainty for safety, power for safety, sameness for safety, silence for safety. But sometimes it gets closer to something truer. Sometimes safety is not domination or control. Sometimes it is trust, repair, enough food, enough rest, an honest boundary, a calm face in the doorway, a room where the body does not brace, a society where fewer people must live in fear. In that possibility lies the real legacy of the hidden survival system. Not only that it has shaped the human past, but that understanding it may yet shape the future with slightly more mercy. The story ends, in a sense, where it began, inside the body, not in the grand abstractions of history or theory, but in the quiet, intimate space between a signal and a response, between uncertainty and breath, between the world outside and the old machinery waiting within. The hidden survival system has been there all along, beneath thought, beneath identity, beneath the versions of ourselves we prefer to present. It has kept count in pulse and muscle, in vigilance and fatigue, in fear and relief. It has carried memories too heavy for words and scanned horizons long after the obvious danger was gone. And yet there is something almost tender in the severity of it. This ancient system does not know how to be elegant. It only knows how to keep watch. It narrows the world when it believes it must. It makes pain unforgettable when forgetting would seem too risky. It clings to people because isolation once meant death. It raises alarm too quickly, stores certain wounds too deeply, and often asks too much of the body that bears it. But in all of this there is a single blunt intention: remain alive long enough for morning to come. Perhaps that is why understanding it changes the emotional shape of so many human experiences. Fear becomes less like cowardice and more like inheritance. Panic becomes less like humiliation and more like a system shouting too loudly. Numbness becomes less like emptiness and more like shelter taken too far inward. Even longing, grief, shame, and love begin to look different once seen through the lens of survival. They are not incidental decorations on an otherwise rational mind. They are part of the old architecture by which life protects what it cannot bear to lose. Beyond the individual, the same truth stretches outward into families, crowds, nations, and centuries. So much of what human beings build is built against vulnerability, walls, rituals, laws, myths, homes, borders, promises, prayers. Some become instruments of care. Others become instruments of fear. Most become both, depending on who is standing inside them and who is left outside. Time moves forward, technology changes, languages vanish, empires rise and break apart. But the older question remains under everything: am I safe here? And with whom? There is no final answer the brain can hold forever. Safety is never absolute, and the old system knows that better than philosophy does. It keeps listening in the dark, it keeps watching faces, it keeps turning history into sensation and memory into expectation. But sometimes, for a few moments, the guard lowers. A room grows quiet in the right way. A trusted hand remains. The body unclenches without being commanded. The future loosens its grip, and in that small lowering of alarm, something remarkable appears. Not perfection, not invulnerability, just a living creature, ancient and temporary, resting at last inside a world it does not need to fear for one more night.